Good morning.
Good morning. How are you this morning?
Uh-oh, you were dragging there.
Yeah, we've got a little bit of a
Yeah.
computer reaction there. I'm not sure what that is.
Can you hear us, Miss Kenzie?
I can hear you. So is my video is dragging behind?
It sounds okay now, but when you said
Yeah.
good morning, it was like
Okay.
really dragged out.
Let me know if that continues to be a problem. We'll see if there's anything I can do.
We
It
will,
seems-
but it's sounding good now. So
Yeah, it sounds fine now.
Great.
might have been just that initial sign on.
I'll just wait a few more seconds.
Miss Kinsley, is there any way we can do one quick broad picture here so I can make sure everybody's the same as was here yesterday?
I think that may be up to you to go to toggle your Zoom to the gallery screen. And in addition,
okay.
I'm going to, yes, and then you can go back,
That's
you
fine.
can toggle back and then you'll see what I think what the view is on YouTube. And then
Right.
I am going to go through introductions, not everyone, but I will see if there's anyone.
Okay, you
who's
are
joining
dragging.
us today.
You're dragging.
Hopefully that will help.
We're not understanding what you're saying.
And see if this will work. I may disconnect for a moment and then I'll try to reconnect. All right, I should have a new internet connection. Is this
Nope, he just glitched again.
all right, I apologize for the technical difficulties here. Maybe I can get some feedback. Is this an improvement in my connection or are we still in the same place?
It's a slight improvement, but you're still dragging on a couple words.
Okay, let me try. I apologize. Let me try a different fix.
Oh, no apologies.
All right, we'll try this again. Good morning, everyone. Can you now see me and hear me clearly?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, great. If this continues to be a problem,
Yes.
I can turn off my video and that may help the feed. I apologize. I've tried a couple of different things, but let me know if things act up going forward. I appreciate your patience as we have technical difficulties. Let's get started. Good morning. I'm Hearing Officer Nicole Kinsey. This is December 10th, 2021. This is the hearing for Phase 1A on the applications of North Kern Water Storage District and City of Shafter, application 31673. City of Bakersfield, application 31674. Buena Vista Water Storage District, application 31675. Kern Water Bank Authority, application 31676. Kern County Water Agency, application 31677. And Rosedale Rio Bravo Water Storage District, application 31819, all for permits to appropriate water from the Kern River system. This is the second day of our hearing. This hearing is being conducted by Zoom web conference and is also being broadcast live on the AHO YouTube channel. Both the audio and video are being recorded, and we will post files of this recording and the Zoom generated transcript to the AHO FTP site. The YouTube recording will also be available on the AHO YouTube webpage. If you are experiencing technical difficulties trying to communicate with us, please send an email to the AHO at adminhrgoffice@waterboards.ca.gov. AHO staff will be monitoring that email inbox. And if I am experiencing technical difficulties today, which hopefully won't be the case going forward, but if I'm unable to reconnect in short order, a member of my staff will call a brief recess so that we can work out those difficulties. I am not going to do a full roll call today. What I'd like to do is ask whether there is anyone new making an appearance today. We'll carry over the appearances from yesterday, but if there is anyone new joining us other than our witnesses, if you would please identify yourself and your affiliation at this time, I would appreciate it. All right, hearing none, what I would like to do is remind us where we left off yesterday, which is, I believe, the city of Bakersfield had concluded the presentation of their case in chief, and we had set ourselves up to consider first thing this morning the exhibits, city of Bakersfield case in chief exhibits. Before we jump into that, I will go ahead and ask the virtual room whether there are any other housekeeping items we should address before we jump into looking to the city of Bakersfield exhibits. All right, Mr. Pierce, I'll look, or Ms. Ainsley, I'll look to you. I think you mentioned that you were going to take a look at your exhibits based on the evidentiary rulings of yesterday morning. And there may be some exhibits that you would not be intending to move into evidence. Maybe the best way to go forward with this is for you to identify those exhibits that you do not intend to move into evidence, but that you had submitted to our office, if there are any.
Yes, good morning, Ms. Kunze. This is Colin Pierce again, appearing for City of Bakersfield. I am hoping that my partner, Joanne Ainsley, is on also.
I see her.
On. Okay, then I'm hoping that she will deal with the evidence this morning.
Great.
Good morning, Ms. Kenzie. We did take a look at all the evidentiary ruling in the paragraphs that you deferred to later phases, and we cross-referenced with all of our witnesses' paragraphs, and we do believe that Bakersfield exhibits 86 and 87 were sponsored only by Mr. Clegg, and they were in paragraphs that you excluded or deferred. And so that we will not be moving Bakersfield 86 and Bakersfield 87 into evidence. In addition, in our cross-checking last night, we also noticed that Bakersfield 99 was an exhibit that we had marked, but that had no sponsoring testimony when our final testimony was finalized. So we will also not be moving into evidence Bakersfield 99. But apart from those three exhibits, we do move to seek to submit into evidence exhibits from our case in chief of 1 through 85, 88 through 98, and then 100 through 112, which should be the remainder of our case in chief exhibits, which had sponsoring testimony, but of course, not including Mr. Florin's rebuttal testimony, which we have not reached that phase of this proceeding.
Thank you.
And let me know if you need me to repeat any of the numbers.
I think I have all of those down, and I am going to now turn to Mr. Cooney or any of your associates to see. I know you had written objections to a number of exhibits submitted by the city of Bakersfield. You have my evidentiary ruling from yesterday morning, which may have changed. I don't know, you can tell me, it changed your motion somewhat. But do you have any objections to, well, let me stop here. Let's do this formally. Ms. Ainsley, I'll turn back to you. Would you like to formally move the exhibits that you identified into evidence? Those are exhibits 1 through 85, Bakersfield exhibits 88 through 98, and Bakersfield exhibits 100 through 112.
Yes, the city of Bakersfield would like to move those identified exhibits into evidence.
Thank you. So now we have that motion formally on the record. Now I will turn to Mr. Cooney. Do you have any objections to the admission of any of those exhibits?
Yes, we do. And I will start this, but I'm certainly going to invite Mr. Stroud to correct me as we go forward and walk through this. And hopefully I'll be clear as we walk through it. I'm just going to proceed sort of top to bottom off the list, if this is helpful. So with regard to exhibits 1 through 6 that are relating to the application file, we recognize that those are certainly in the application file, but they don't appear to be probative actually to the issue to be determined in this phase 1A. We are, of course, here as applicants, and the city is as well. And in particular, exhibits 1 and 2 are actually part of an application that was dismissed by the state board. There was a petition filed by Bakersfield to get it reinstated. The board said no and in an order of reconsideration. So and I'll actually bring this topic into also, then this would also be applying to 97, 98, and then now 100. So our basic point is we don't refute that there are documents in the application file. We do not believe that they are probative to the issue to be determined. So we would request that the hearing officer put a limiting condition on that they are part of the file, but they're not making, you're not making determination that that's probative to the issue. So that's one topic. And I'm going to go through them and then we can have our further discussion.
Yes, please.
Then with regard to Bakersfield 7 through 13, which are the testimonial exhibits, we understand that you've made your ruling and we are in the process, as you had asked us, to review that and, as it were, modify our, I'll call it redaction. We haven't yet completed that and verified it. We've completed it. I'm trying to do a double check. We don't have a transcript and we're working off of notes. I think we're close, and I suspect we'll have that back to you by noon or soon thereafter. So we understand that those are coming in, but subject to your ruling. So we appreciate that and we understand that. With regard to exhibits Bakersfield 21 to 24, those all relate to the Kern River Flow and Municipal Water Program draft EIR. In light of your ruling to exclude the testimony with regard to that, we think it necessarily follows that those documents likewise are excluded, contrary to Bakersfield's position. So we would say 21, 22, 23, and 24 have been excluded, consistent with your ruling on the testimony. And actually, excuse me, let me expand that. And that would also include 83, 85, and 88, where you made exclusions with regard to technical effects of the flow program or testimony relating to Sigma documents, plans, and such. So again, we would think, consistent with your ruling, 21, 22, 23, 24, 83, 85, and 88 all should be excluded, consistent with your ruling. And with regard to exhibits 84, 89, 90, 91, and 92, our understanding of your ruling was that you were accepting this for the purposes of description of current conditions of diversion and use of water or current conditions, but you were deferring those exhibits as they may relate to some future consideration in a future proceeding. I just want to make sure that I was understanding the ruling in that regard. And with that understanding, we agree that they can be accepted for current conditions, but deferred as to future projected conditions. Then I guess the next, that also, excuse me, that also applies, that same notion is with exhibits 101 through 105, and also 111 to 112, to which you indicated that it had relevance for some background information on current conditions, but you were also deferring any consideration of those exhibits as it may relate to future conditions. That's the same concept. And then with regard to Bakersfield 106 and its errata, 106 errata, and 107 and Bakersfield 110, you may recall that we provided detailed legal objections in the motion in limine to those documents as they violated and were contrary to your legal ruling, because they all presume and accept as a starting position that all water above the caps is unappropriated water. In examination of witnesses, Mr. Core and Mr. Chianello, they affirmed that testimony. That's exactly what they provide. And so we restate our objection on those exhibits, and they should be excluded in total as they are completely irrelevant, contrary to your legal ruling, and provide no probative value in this proceeding whatsoever. Mr. Stroud, did I leave something out? Please clean up behind me.
I'm going through the list here to see that you didn't, and I don't think, I think you addressed everything except obviously the resumes, the statements of qualifications,
Oh, yeah.
coming along with the testimony. No objection on that.
Yeah, and no objection to the resumes. We agree that those move into evidence.
Great, thank you, Mr. Cooney and Mr. Stroud. Give me one moment to digest, and then I'm going to have questions.
Fair enough.
But I think I have all this down, and this makes, I have this organized. Well, I guess, so here's where we are, so we can focus our discussion on a few things. I'll tell you my ruling. I do want to rule on a few of these, and then I want to hear more from you on a few of these. I am going to allow in Bakersfield exhibits 1 through 6. That's the application file. I'm not going to put a caveat on its admission, but I do think those documents are appropriate to have in the record, and they say what they say. They speak for themselves. So I'm going to allow those in. 97, 98, and 100. Actually, maybe Ms. Ainsley, can you remind me what those are? I didn't have those in my notes explicitly as documents that came up. So maybe you can remind me. I will also be looking. Remind me what those exhibits are.
So 97 is 97 and 98, though they were raised by two different witnesses. 97 I have was raised by Mr. Chianello, and 98 is the 1996 petition and application that the city did indeed submit, and that was raised by Mr. Core in paragraph 54 of his testimony. Both of those were part and parcel of sort of the history of the Kern River proceedings. They both are likely, 97 is the State Water Board's letter to the applicants, and 98 is the City of Bakersfield's 1996 petition and application. They both had sponsoring testimony. They are both in the nature of background information and the posture of the parties, and basically just the history of this proceeding. So we do not feel that they were controversial. And like I said, they both have sponsoring testimony, and I'm happy to give you those paragraph numbers again.
Thank you, Ms. Ainsley. Your description is very helpful. So my ruling is to allow into the evidentiary record 97, 98, and 100. I think that's also helpful background information, and the documents once again speak for themselves. I am going to allow into the record, as you indicated, Mr. Cooney, Bakersfield exhibits 7 through 13 with subject to my evidentiary ruling and the redactions that we discussed. And we will be receiving redacted versions from Mr. Cooney's office later. I appreciate having it in a timely manner, but I don't think we need it. Nobody's hair is on fire. And we will review those redactions and make sure they appear appropriate to my office. And then Ms. Ainsley, if you have any concerns or you think there's any errors in the redactions, then you can let us know and we'll deal with that as appropriate. Now moving to the remainder, this is where I would like to hear more from you, Ms. Ainsley. Let's start with the documents 21 through 24, and then 83, 85, and 88 that I understand relate to the flow program. Would you like to respond to Mr. Cooney's objections to those documents?
I would, and I will do the best I can. It gets a little complicated, obviously, with so many witnesses, and I'll invite, if I miss something, for Mr. Pierce to add in. I'd like to start, well, first of all, 21 through 24 are indeed the official certified as a package whole EIR for the Kern River Flow and Municipal Water Program. There were a number of sponsoring testimonies which were deferred by your ruling. I have noted those down. However, these documents were also identified in paragraphs that you did not exclude. Speaking just now and that was Mr. Schwartz, paragraph 3 was the sponsoring testimony. These are part of his qualifications, and he indeed was the preparer or the supervisor who led the team that prepared these exhibits. Bakersfield 21 was also used by Dr. Cullen and Dr. Schwartz to describe and point to current and past conditions on the Kern River. So Bakersfield 21, the EIR, had an additional citations that were documentation of Kern River conditions. 22, 23, and 24, as I noted, were also cited by Dr. Schwartz, and they are just part and parcel of his qualifications and document conditions on the river that led to the city's application.
Ms. Kunze, this is Colin Pierce. I would also add that, your ruling on the testimony yesterday was geared more towards focusing on future events, and you excluded, for example, testimony from Dr. Schwartz that addressed the city's intention to implement the Kern River Flow and Municipal Water Program in the future using the forfeited water or the forfeiture releases. The environmental documents that are the subject of these objections are sort of in a different category because these are, CEQA documents, and as I'm sure everyone knows, the CEQA has to look at the baseline conditions, and CEQA documents have to identify current conditions. So in addition to what Ms. Ainsley stated, we believe these documents are highly relevant to show the past and current conditions on the Kern River, as well as the City of Bakersfield's past and present use of Kern River water. And in fact, the Kern River Municipal Flow and Water Program, the intention of the program is to utilize not just the newly available forfeiture releases, but also the city's current water rights and in the current water supply it's utilizing.
Thank you, Ms. Ainsley and Mr. Pierce. What I will ask you, and Mr. Cooney, you'll have your chance to respond, or Mr. Stroud. What I want to ask next is with respect to the documents that Mr. Cooney identified that would be in his view, acceptable for admission into the record, subject to the condition, the caveat or condition that they would be considered with respect to current or past conditions only, and not future conditions or future uses of water. Do you have, and I believe those are document exhibits 84, 89, 90, 91, 92, 101 to 105, and then 111 to 112. Would you like to respond to Mr. Cooney's either objections or your position on the acceptance with the caveat?
Can you repeat the numbers again? I apologize. I heard I have two different categories here.
Yeah, I know there are many. And Mr. Cooney, feel free to speak up if I'm misidentifying these. I believe it's 84, 89, 90, 91, and 92. And then in addition, subject to the same condition about current or past conditions only, 101 through 105, 111, and 112. Does that sound right to you, Mr. Cooney? Was that accurate?
Yeah, that is accurate.
Thank you.
Those are the ones that we've identified that are limited to current conditions and precluding consideration of future conditions for a later proceeding.
Well, as to some of these exhibits, maybe starting at the end and going forward, I mean, the document with the testimony that sponsored these documents, they do describe current conditions. The Bakersfield 111 and 112, which are the Buena Vista Lake True materials, the 111 dates from December of 2004 and 112 dates from October of 2011. So, you know, with the sponsoring testimony, they already speak to past conditions. I'm not sure there needs to be, the documents speak for themselves. I'm not sure there needs to be any sort of limitation on the hearing officer. I assume the hearing officer will look at them with respect to the context of the testimony. So I'm not sure I quite understand, you know, much as any of these documents, they speak for themselves and they are already historic documents. And I would say that in particular with 111 and 112.
I think that's helpful. 111 and 112, that may be let's look at something.
Yeah, I'm just trying to
Maybe
figure out.
So for example, I think Bakersfield, well, let's see.
Let me clarify. I mean, what Bakersfield is telling you is these documents, and let's use 111 as example. There are current conditions to which they say they have beneficially been using water that have relevance to habitat for the shrew. They're also trying to advocate that in the future, under that very same habitat management plan, there would be a future use of future supply to which that plan would be relevant. We are saying that there's a demarcation point between the current condition and the future condition. And the future condition will be addressed if and when there is a proof by Bakersfield there's unappropriated water. They haven't made that element of proof. So yes, the demarcation is appropriate because they are anticipating to point to that very same report as to a future use of supply and a future benefit that would come to the habitat for the shrew. So they go both ways.
Well, and thank you, Mr. Cooney. I think I appreciate your comments. I think, you know, Ms. Ainsley can speak to what Bakersfield is trying to do, but I would like just to clarify our understanding of this demarcation. I do think 111 is maybe a particularly difficult example. I was looking at, let's see, give me a moment. All right, let's look at Bakersfield 89. This is the Bakersfield General Plan, Kern River element dated August 15th, 2007. Typically, general plans would include a description of current conditions and then also a plan for the future and plans for future water use. This may be a better example where we might have a discussion in the document of both current uses of water, current conditions, and then also future proposed uses. So with respect to that document or that document as an example, Ms. Ainsley, given my evidentiary ruling, I am inclined to accept, for example, that document with the caveat that it will not be considered in this phase of the proceeding for purposes of considering future uses of water by the city of Bakersfield, because that issue is deferred until a later phase of this proceeding. Do you have any objection to that caveat that you would like to make for the record or to persuade me otherwise?
Well, so Bakersfield 88 does indeed describe the conditions of the Kern River Basin as of 2020 and before. It's the summation of many studies, obviously, and it was used by Mr. Cianello in paragraph 15 of his testimony and Mr. Cullen for that purpose. I hear what you're saying, that phase one here is only considering current and past conditions and uses of water, of Kern River water, I'm not sure that there needs to be an evidentiary caveat. I think that the caveat is on the phase 1 hearing itself, and it is up to the hearing officer to use the documents in the manner in which this phase is been now set up by your evidentiary ruling. So I guess I'm not sure that we're not on the same page, but I'm not sure why the rulings need to be putting in some arbitrary demarcation when we understand that it's the hearing officer's consideration of these documents that will be limited in a sense. So I'm not sure I'm exactly understanding, where it is and what line we're drawing with respect to specific documents. I mean, Bakersfield 101 to 104 are individual figures. They were used specifically to show past conditions. I'm not sure they need any sort of caveat at all, considering that they're mostly flat charts or tables of existing conditions. So maybe Mr. Pierce wants to weigh in, but I assume that what we're talking about is actually just the framing of phase 1, and I'm not really sure that affects the documents. I think it affects your use of the documents.
Mr. Pierce, you're welcome to comment at this time if you would like to.
I don't think I have anything to add. I think Ms. Ainsley sums up our position. That I think that I guess the big point is that you're hearing you've already limited and given some restrictions on the issues you're going to consider in this hearing. I think that applies, as she said, to everything that's coming in today and yesterday.
Thank you. I think at this time I'm prepared to rule on these issues, which is I am going to allow in and overrule the objections with respect to exhibits 21 through 24, 83, 85, and 88, 84, 89, 90, 91, and 92, 101 to 105, and 111 and 112. I think our discussion today indicates that we actually have a meeting of the minds on the appropriate consideration of these documents, that they will be considered to the extent that they're relevant to the issues framed in phase 1A of this proceeding, which includes the current and past uses of water by the city of Bakersfield, and not the future proposed uses of water, that issue being deferred to a later phase of this proceeding, in which case these documents may be relevant in a different respect to those issues. With respect to the 106 errata, 107 and 110, which North Kern objected to on the basis that they contain inappropriate legal opinion and are contrary to my legal ruling of November 3rd, I am going to overrule that objection and allow those documents in, subject to, well, not subject to anything, but just noting that I have the ability to consider those documents with respect to their relevant and to the extent that they contained maybe inaccurate or are based on inaccurate legal principles, that will be taken into account when I am weighing granting them respective weight as a matter of evidence in reaching a proposed decision in this proceeding. Now my challenge is to sum that all up. I think based on all of those rulings, what we have is an acceptance of all of the documents that the city of Bakersfield has offered into evidence today. We excluded, or I should say not excluded, but 86, 87, and 99 were not offered into evidence. But I believe based on my rulings now, the remainder will be accepted into the evidentiary record. Does that match? I'll turn to maybe Ms. Ainsley, and you can take a moment, but does that match your understanding?
My understanding, if I could try to summarize, is that Bakersfield exhibits 1 through 112, which are its case in chief, with the exception of only Bakersfield 86, 87, and 99 have been admitted into evidence. This is subject to your evidentiary rule.
Subject to my evidentiary ruling and the redactions that we mentioned with respect to the testimonial evidence.
Correct.
Yes. They are hereby accepted into evidence, but I will turn to Mr. Cooney. If you have any, if you find that my ruling and what I just said mismatches in some way, you can either bring it up now or raise it later in the hearing today, and we will make any corrections that need to be made. This was fairly complicated.
From my notes, I think that is what you have ruled. I think that is the ultimate conclusion. I will double check, but I think that is exactly what you've said.
Accurate. Okay, thank you. And thank you for moving through that. I think it's of course important. At this point, I believe we are ready to turn to North Kern and the city of Shafter to present your case in chief and your witnesses. I'll look to you, Mr. Cooney. Are you prepared to begin now, or do you need a few minutes, a break for a few minutes to queue up your witnesses?
I believe we're prepared to proceed now. Is that true, Mr. Stroud?
Yes, we are ready to go.
Okay. Yeah. Yes, we are, Hearing Officer Kunze. We're prepared to proceed.
Thank you. So we'll start, I think, Mr. Cooney, with any opening statement that you may have, and then we will move to your first witness.
Yes, thank you very much. And I would like to have a brief opening statement. Again, I am appearing on behalf of North Kern Water Storage District and the city of Shafter in reference to our application. But actually, fundamentally, it's important, and I think you well recognize this, that we are here in a position of somewhat ironically saying that though we are the applicant first in order in this proceeding, we're actually advocating that there is no evidence of unappropriated water for which the state board can issue a permit as it relates to the issue at hand, and that is the forfeiture of water rights as determined by the North Kern appellate decision. So the purpose of this hearing has been clearly defined and stated by the hearing officer. You have been very articulate about the scope of this hearing. We're here these 2 days only for one purpose, and that is to receive evidence relevant to one issue. Did the partial forfeiture of water rights by the Kern Delta Water District, as determined by the court in North Kern, result in unappropriated water in the Kern River system? And if so, if that is affirmatively determined based upon competent evidence, if so, in what amount, what season, what time, etc. There is only one party that has attempted to submit testimony or documents in this phase 1A hearing to support the conclusion that the North Kern court decision results in unappropriated water in the Kern River system. Only the city of Bakersfield, in an effort to create support for its application, 31674, claims that unappropriated water results from the North Kern decision. As you are well aware, that because Bakersfield as the applicant is claiming the existence of unappropriated water in this phase 1A hearing, a foundational principle of law must be applied. Water Code section 1375D requires that Bakersfield prove that there is unappropriated water available to supply the applicant. Similarly, Water Code section 1260K requires Bakersfield to present to you competent evidence to demonstrate a reasonable likelihood that unappropriated water is available. And the state board's hearing back in 2010, when those proceedings had concluded, likewise made it clear that it was up to Bakersfield to show when and how much water there is for appropriation. That's how we left the proceedings in 2010. Bakersfield's proffer of written testimony and documents, we've heard it so far, and I respect your rulings, I truly do, just simply fails to demonstrate based upon any kind of competent evidence, facts, in compliance with the governing principles of law consistent with your ruling. And your ruling was really an affirmation of the Court of Appeal, and the Court of Appeal was an affirmation of longstanding doctrine of prior appropriation. The facts that Bakersfield has proffered to you simply fail to satisfy their burden of proof that any unappropriated water results from the North Kern decision after consideration of the amount beneficially used by right holders pursuant to their existing water rights in order of priority. Now, there's a really stark contrast and comparison between what Bakersfield has proposed and offered to you and what North Kern and the city of Shafter have worked diligently to provide you as the hearing officer with extensive and focused testimony. We have provided you and will present to you a detailed technical engineering study and supporting documents, all of which are directly relevant to the issue that you have identified in your August 30 status conference ruling. Likewise, North Kern and the city of Shafter carefully focus all of the proposed evidence to make certain it strictly adheres to your November 3rd ruling on legal issues. It was a correct ruling. It's the law of California, and it has to be applied here. And this evidence is limited to the one issue that will be determined in this phase 1A. There's just one issue, and that is, did that partial forfeiture of water rights by the Kern Delta Water District, which had its rights extinguished in total as a matter of law above the caps, result in unappropriated water in the Kern River system? And if so, what's the amount of that? What season is it? What conditions does it exist? Now, in full respect to your schedule to have this phase 1A completed by the end of business today, which we fully support, and your advisement that you have carefully read and studied both the written testimony and the reference exhibits presented to you by North Kern, I'm not going to dedicate time this morning to walk you through that. As the hearing officer is aware, at the conclusion of the state board's hearing in 2010, a final resolution of the issue of whether the North Kern court decision resulted in any unappropriated water was not clearly resolved. Unfortunately, it was deferred. They did say that the evidence didn't clearly resolve it. We find intertie water evidence to modify the FAS, but they defer. In this phase 1A hearing, we've now honed the issue sharply to the issue at hand, and it now must be finally resolved. In summary, the evidence presented by North Kern and the city of Shafter clearly and absolutely demonstrates 2 points. There's no unappropriated water available from the Kern River as a result of the North Kern decision of partial forfeiture of water rights, because all of the Kern River water released according to the court's decision declaring that Kern Delta forfeited and had all of its rights extinguished above the caps is subject to diversion and use by the next most senior rights in order of priority under existing Kern River entitlements. In light of that answer, therefore, the answer to the second question that you articulated, well, if there was some, what would be the amount? That answer is likewise certain. The answer is none. So that is our opening statement. We're prepared to move forward with witnesses that will focus on the issue that you presented to be decided in this phase 1A.
Thank you, Mr. Cuny. And will you please identify for me your first witness who you plan to call?
Yes, our first witness will be Mr. Ron Ide.
Mr. Ide, there you are. I see you on camera. Would you please raise your right hand for me?
Yes.
Mr. Ide, do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you will give in this hearing will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you. Mr. Cuny, you may proceed with the testimony of your first witness.
Very good. Mr. Ide, can you hear me well enough? And do we have all of our Zoom bugs worked out? Everything?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
Okay, very good. Can you please state your full name and business address for the record?
My name is Ronald, Ronald, middle initial J, last name Eid, EID. My business address is 5001 California Avenue, Suite 120, Bakersfield, California, 93309.
Very good. Can we have Ms. Mullins please pull up North Kern 66? Very good, thank you. Mr. Ide, can you see that?
Yes, I can.
What is North Kern 66?
This is a copy of my current professional resume.
And does this professional resume, North Kern 66, provide a current summary of your 43 years of experience as a professional engineer?
Yes, it does. It's, as you say, a summary. Doesn't list every assignment project, but gives a good cross-section.
And what is your educational background?
I have a Bachelor's of Science degree in civil engineering from the University of California at Davis.
And are you a licensed engineer in the state of California?
Yes, I'm a licensed civil engineer.
As a licensed professional engineer, have you concentrated your career in a particular subject or practice area?
Yes, I have spent my entire career working in the area of water resources engineering.
Now, I know in reviewing your resume, there's a heading of project experience, a description of a large number of water resources projects. But can you please highlight for the hearing officer a few of your projects that most directly relate to the professional engineering work that you have completed as it relates to the issue at hand in phase 1A of this Kern River proceeding?
Well, a number of the projects involve surface water hydrology and hydraulics. I've spent a fair bit of time working in that area, particularly relevant to this proceeding. I was first introduced to Kern River in the Kern River and related matters in 1977. And I conducted my first evaluation of Kern River supply and use, and that initial work. As part and parcel of that work, I became familiar with the Kern River first point flow and diversion records, the annual hydrographic reports, Isabella Reservoir operations, and some of the agreements that govern the administration of Kern River water rights. I have, subsequent to that initial work, I have from time to time over the years conducted water supply and use studies, looking at, again, these same historical records, evaluating potential changed conditions and the effect of those changed conditions on water supply and use. I've conducted a number of reservoir operation studies as a part of that same work. And most of it could be characterized as supporting negotiations to resolve water right disputes and differences on the river. So it's in support of negotiations, mediation, and ultimately litigation.
In that work, did you concentrate in reviewing then the hydrology of the Kern River? Is that one of the topics?
Yes,
And did you also make detailed review of the daily, monthly, and annual records of the Kern River historically?
yes, I have.
And historical records back to the 19th century all the way to the present, is that true?
That's correct.
And did you also, again, as part of your background and experience, become familiar with the various court decisions and agreements and practices that relate to the daily administration of the Kern River?
Yes,
And you've done that work, then is it fair to say you've done that consistently from 1977 up through, I guess, this morning? Is that still the case?
yes. As I mentioned, it's not been a continuous exercise by any means, but the efforts to negotiate, settle, and otherwise resolve Kern River water right differences has gone hot and cold, and I've responded to those over that entire period of time.
And your effort then has been, though, really in advising and showing what the records were on the Kern River, both from hydrologic vantage point, but also in terms of the daily administration of the respective rights that in particular relate to the First Point group on the Kern River system?
That is correct. And you are correct that my focus has been principally on the First Point group and First Point water supply.
If I could have Ms. Mullen please pull up North Kern 1, please. And this is a lengthy document, but why don't we just, if you can, please just, let's give us the first cover page, and that may help.
I was asked to address the issue or questions that were posed for this phase 1A hearing and address them from the standpoint of review of the historical records and prepare a report regarding my analysis. And this is the cover page of that report that was prepared here, obviously very recently, and dated November 2021.
So this report entitled North Kern Water Storage District and City of Shafter's Forfeiture Judgment Technical Analysis in response to the administrating hearing officer's statement of the issue to be determined in the phase 1 hearing of the Kern River proceedings. This was prepared by you?
That is correct.
If we could, and you can and will undoubtedly provide further information with regard to that report. If you can, Ms. Mullen, can you pull up North Kern 65? Thank you very much. Now, Mr. I, this is the first page of North Kern Exhibit 65, titled Written Testimony of Ronald J. Ide. Can you identify this for the hearing officer, please? What is this?
This is my written testimony informed by the report that I prepared. So it relates a number of, the analysis and the findings and conclusion that are detailed in the report are summarized in my written testimony.
Now, here this morning, have you had a chance to make a review of both your written testimony and your technical analysis to determine whether or not there are any revisions that you need to make it accurate or consistent with your expert opinion?
I'm not aware of any revisions that are called for at this point.
Thank you. Now, Ms. Mullins, if you can pull up North Kern 97, the PowerPoint version. There is both a PDF version and a PowerPoint version, but please pull up the PowerPoint version. That's great. Now, Mr. Ide, can you see that?
Yes, I can.
And Hearing Officer Kunze, can you see this well enough, and all the other parties? I want to make sure it's clear on the screen.
I can see it very well, and you all may notice I wore my glasses today, so I can read the small print now.
Very good. So, Mr. Ide, before you proceed forward, I just want to, let's just work off of the cover page of this document, North Kern 97. What is this document? What is this?
This is a presentation that I've prepared excuse me, in PowerPoint to provide an overview of my analysis, findings, and conclusion. So it's a further distillation of the report and written testimony. So it's very much an overview.
And this was consistent with, I think I told you that, that the hearing officer had asked, please don't just repeat verbatim what you've put in written testimony, but try to give an overview.
Yes.
And so is that in the spirit of this?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So if the hearing officer needed to, there'd be greater detail both in your technical analysis exhibit 1 or in your written testimony, North Kern 65, but this will be an overview of the analysis and conclusions in summary form. Is that fair?
Yes.
So I'm going to really suggest that why don't you please explain to the hearing officer your summary testimony through this exhibit 97, and I'll leave it to you to explain to her your analysis, findings, conclusions that are represented in your technical analysis and in your written testimony.
If I could have the next slide, please. Well, the issue for this phase was fairly clearly set forth in correspondence from the Administrative Hearings Office, and you'll indulge me in probably the repetition, but the question is, did the partial forfeiture of water rights by Kern Delta Water District, as determined by the court in North Kern v. Kern Delta, result in unappropriated water in the Kern River system? And if so, what is the amount of that unappropriated water? If I could have the next slide, please. These are my so-called engineering questions that I've framed up when I was asked to address the questions for this phase. And the first is, what does the North Kern decision, AKA judgment or forfeiture judgment, require to Has the forfeiture judgment been enforced since it was issued in 2007? Thirdly, if yes, is there a record of enforcement? And finally, if yes, does the record indicate that there is unappropriated water in the Kern River system as a result of the forfeiture judgment? The next slide, please. Well, we saw this a minute ago. This is the cover sheet of the report that I prepared, and I was retained to make an engineering analysis of the questions at issue for this phase on behalf of applicants, North Kern Water Storage District and the city of Shafter. And that report and my written testimony are, and this summary are all part of that effort. Next slide, please. I might mention that for the remainder of my presentation, which isn't very long, all references to report are to the report that I prepared. So I'll just use that shorthand, hopefully in the interest of time and repeating myself too much. This is the quick outline, beginning with just a general orientation to Kern River, an overview of the apportionment of Kern River water, with focus on, first point, clearly, the 2007 forfeiture judgment and what it requires. Then, excuse me, something popped up on my screen, and maybe I can get some help in.
Take your time.
Okay. Fortunately, there was help handy. And then number 4 is a quick look at the Kern River hydrographic records that were reviewed and were the basis for my analysis. A quick overview of the review and analysis, and finally, findings and conclusion. So with that, if I could have the next slide, please. So, and you can go on to the next one. Thank you. So this is a map of the Kern River system, and it's fairly simple. And up in the upper right, we have Isabella Reservoir, and then the Kern River trending south and west, entering the southern, the San Joaquin Valley in the Kern County area. So this is the southern portion of the San Joaquin Valley. And what we see highlighted in different colors are the applicants, most of the applicants, hopefully, in this process are highlighted north of the river, in that sort of elongated north-south. In the green, we have the North Kern Water Storage District, and we see that overlapped in part by the city of Shafter as well. Both the north and south forks of the Kern River flow into and contribute to Isabella Reservoir, and the total drainage area above the reservoir is about 2,100 square miles. As we come down into the San Joaquin Valley, we have the first of 2 significant and historical points of measurement on the river that are relevant to and the basis for the administration of Kern River water rights. The first one being simply called first point of measurement. It's probably named by an engineer. And it's just to the east of the city of Bakersfield. And then we follow that down stream. We see a second point of measurement. Not sure if if I have the colors exactly right, but they're kind of a yellowish circle highlighting those two key points of measurement. And I mentioned that these points were established in the late 1800s and have been the basis for water rights administration from that time until the present. I might say that, excuse me, that first point of measurement at that location, the drainage area is on the order of 2,400 square miles. So we add a little over 300 square miles of additional watershed or drainage area below the reservoir and above first point of measurement. The daily apportionment of the river is based on the natural or unimpaired flow of the river at first point of measurement. With that, if you could go to the next slide, and I believe the next one after that, I've basically covered this slide while we were looking at the map. So next slide, please. Thank you. This comes from figure 2 in my report, and it presents the annual calendar year natural flow volume of Kern River at first point of measurement for the period of record. And that period is from 1894 through 2020. As can be seen in the bar chart of those annual flow volumes, the annual flow is highly variable from year to year. I have noted that the average is on the order of 716,000 acre feet for that period of time. And it's also noteworthy that on the Kern, at least, that 2 out of 3 years are less than that average. So we tend to be a river that's on the short side more often than not. There are 2 years that do stand out and above, literally, both 1969 and 1983, each of which had total annual calendar year flow volumes on the order of 2.5 million acre feet, which in both cases is about 500,000 acre feet above any other years of record in that period. Next slide, please. Thank you. This is figure 3 in my report, and it simply presents a picture, a visual of the mean monthly natural flow of Kern River at first point of measurement, again for the same period of record. On average, the flows are highest during the spring snowmelt. As we can see visually, the flows are lowest in the fall and early winter, and those are the forfeiture months, the months affected by the forfeiture judgment. And as we can see in the months of August through December, which are 5 of those 6 months, the mean monthly flow is 500 CFS or less. Then in the month of January, which is the other forfeiture month of the total of 6, with a mean of perhaps 600, but in all cases much lower period of flow in the river. In fact, almost 80% of the annual flow volume occurs in the non-forfeiture months, or conversely, about 20% of the annual flow volume occurs in the forfeiture months. Next slide, please. Briefly, I have a couple slides to just, again, provide a pretty high-level overview of the apportionment of Kern River water. If I could have the next slide, please. This is figure 4 in my report, and it presents a timeline with regard to decrees and judgments and contracts and agreements that have been entered into over time since the initial appropriations in the 1870s, and also highlighted in blue font are some key physical changes. The first, perhaps largest or most noteworthy, being the construction of Isabella Dam and Reservoir, which went into operation in 1954. So these are selected agreements. It's not a complete universe of, but it provides a good highlight, an overview, I should say, for the development of those governing agreements and contracts. It's noteworthy that the apportionment of Kern River water is based on the daily natural flow of the river at first point of measurement. So the river is administered daily as a function of the natural flow at first point. And with the construction of Isabella Dam and Reservoir in 1954, it has been necessary to calculate that natural flow, what it would have been in the absence of the storage and regulation that Isabella now provides. And my reference to law of the river upon which the apportionment is based is a reference to this collection of decrees, agreements, and judgments and practices that inform the daily apportionment of Kern River water. Next slide, please. Well, very simply, Kern River, this is obviously very high altitude. Kern River water is apportioned to the first point group, which includes North Kern Water Storage District, Kern Delta Water District, and the city of Bakersfield. Also the second point group, represented by Buena Vista Water Storage District, and Lower River Group, represented by Kern County Water Agency. If I can have the next slide, please. As regards the apportionment to the first point group, the amount of water available to the first point group is diversion rights on a given day is equal to the natural flow on that day, less each of the following, to the extent that they apply, depending on the time of year, the month, the flow rate. But that first consideration is any apportionment to the second point group would be, under the law of the river, would be deducted or would reduce the flow available to first point. The natural flow would further be reduced by any river channel seepage loss to deliver the second point group apportionment to second point of measurement, which is a requirement under the Miller-Hagen Agreement. Again, if applicable. The third reduction would be First Point group's contribution to the apportionment to the lower river group, if any. And finally, a small fixed seepage loss between First Point of measurement and Rocky Point Weir, where Rocky Point Weir is the point at which diversions are made to into the Carrier Canal, and upstream of which the Beardsley Canal diverts water to the north to the North Kern area. So this is a little bit downstream of First Point and represents the point of, by that point, we have most of the principal diversions are made. Next slide, please. The amount apportioned to the First Point group, once we have that amount, it is further apportioned then to the individual Kern River diversion rights, which make up that group. And those rights are listed in order of priority on the flow and diversion records. And at the right-hand side of this slide is a reproduction of the listing that appears on the First Point flow and diversion records, listing the individual diversion rights and their respective amounts as in CFS, I might add, as indicated in the Shaw Decree, both as to amount and to order of priority. There is also a column, the first column labeled River Stage, which is also in CFS, and that is simply an accumulation of those individual amounts. So for example, at the first right, Kern Island, we have 300 CFS. We get to the next right in order of priority, in Castro at 20 CFS. So the river stage is listed as 320, which would be the stage required to reach the Castro and fill it. And there would be no natural flow going beyond that if that were the only the natural flow available on that day. The natural flow on a given day determines which rights receive an initial allocation of water on that day. And I just use as an example, if the natural flow is 1,000 CFS, then all of the rights from the Kern Island first through the Johnson would receive an initial allocation. If we look at the schedule on the right and drop down in the name of canal to the Johnson, which is about midway down, we see a river stage corresponding to the Johnson of a little over 1,000 CFS. And so that's the way, very simply, how the natural flow influences the initial allocation of water each and every day in order of priority. Next slide, please. Very briefly, I have a couple of slides just to.
Could we go back? You didn't speak to the last point. What was that last point on your slide there?
Oh, I'm sorry. I did miss one. Thank you. When an initial allocation is not diverted on a given day, the excess is, quote, released to the river end, quote, and made available to other rights in order of right and priority. Thank you. I glossed over that. Now, if I could have the next slide, please. I now have a couple slides only to just provide, again, a very quick overview of the 2007 forfeiture judgment. If I could have the next slide in that regard, please. The judgment limits the right to divert and use Kern River water by 4 of the diversion rights within the First Point group, namely Kern Delta's Kern Island First, Buena Vista First, Stein, and Farmers rights. There's a further limitation. It's limited to 6 months of the year, and those months I've referred to simply as forfeiture months, and I believe I previously mentioned that they include January and the months of August through December. The forfeiture judgment set volumetric limits in acre feet on the monthly diversion and use of those named rights, and I've referred to those as forfeiture caps. The judgment did not affect the daily diversion, use, or distribution of Kern River water, except to the extent that the monthly volumetric limits are reached or triggered in a given month, and then obviously subsequent daily diversion and use would be affected. Next slide, please. So this is table 1 from my report, and it simply is a summary of the forfeiture caps set forth in the judgment. And by way of example, if we look at the Kern Island First and drop down to the bottom for the month of December, the Kern Island First is limited to using no more than 2,050 acre feet. And it's a similar story for the other rights and months, and where there is no number indicated, there was no constraint on the diversion and use placed on that right in that month under the judgment. So for example, if I use the month of January and we move over to either the Stein or the Farmers, neither of those 2 rights are limited in the month of January. They are in other months, and so on. Next slide, please. I just want to introduce the records, which were the basis for my analysis and report. And if I could have the next slide, I'll begin that overview. This is a copy which I believe has become somewhat familiar in the testimony presented thus far. And this is a copy of one of the Kern River First Point flow and diversion records. This one is the record for December 15, 2019. The daily flow and diversion record, of which this is an example, is the primary record of the natural flow and its daily distribution in accordance with the law of the river. This same form is used for monthly summaries that are prepared of these daily records. And these records have been completed and maintained by the City of Bakersfield's Water Resources Department since the mid-1970s. The area highlighted in blue will be enlarged a little bit, hopefully a little easier to read on the next slide. And if we could go to that one, please. Again, this is the blown up or enlarged portion of that December 15, 2019 record. This is reflective of all of the First Point group rights, and it indicates that on this particular day, just for example, if we look under the column labeled gross entitlement where entitlement is abbreviated. We see that 7 of the rights received an initial apportionment of the natural flow. And where there is an amount shown next to a right, that would be their initial apportionment. The total on this particular day at the bottom of that gross entitlement column is 574 CFS. And again, we're looking at units of CFS on this daily sheet. If we look at under the general heading releases and a subheading to river, there are 3 rights that are indicated to have released water that day. The first being the Kern Island in the amount of 300 CFS. The second being the Buena Vista First in the amount of 77 CFS. And the third being the Stein in the amount of 34 CFS. And those 3 rights were, in this case, on this day, required to release the entirety of their initial apportionment because they had previously, within the first 2 weeks of between December 1 and December 14, they had uses that accumulated and totaled to the amount of the forfeiture caps, which was limiting their diversion and use. So beginning or on this day and any subsequent days in the month of December of 2019, any of that initial apportionment appearing in the gross entitlement column would be shown and is shown to have been released to the river. That total amount released at the bottom of that column is indicated to be 411 CFS. In the very next column, again, under the general heading of releases, but distribution of releases, we have a listing of the distribution of that water that was released by Kern Island, Buena Vista First, and Stein diversion rights. And in this case, on this day, 13 of the individual First Point group rights received a distribution of the releases. And if we look at the bottom of that column, we see that 411 CFS was distributed to individual rights in the amounts shown. And if we look at, for example, if we look at the Meacham right, which received a distribution of 30 CFS, 30 corresponds to the amount indicated just to the left of the diversion right name, Meacham. So on that same line, we see 30. Similarly, when we drop down to the Plunkett, received an allocation of 40 CFS. And again, that corresponds to the 40 that appears just to the left of, next to the Plunkett under the diversion right columns to the left of this sheet. If we perhaps should have started logically, perhaps a little higher, but if we go, excuse me. If we look at the James First, it had an initial apportionment on that day of 115 CFS. If we look at the distribution of releases, the James received 5 CFS for a total of 120 CFS, which appears under the, a little further to the right, under the series of columns under the general heading entitlement less releases or plus distributed releases under the column labeled NKWSD for North Kern. And that 120, we again see corresponds to the amount shown just to the left of the James listing in the diversion rights. So the distribution of release was enough to, when added to the initial apportionment, arrived at the total listed right of 120 CFS. So the releases are distributed in that same manner, in order of right and priority, until they're all distributed. So on this particular day, we see that there are a number of rights toward the bottom third of this sheet that did not receive an apportionment of Kern River water. Excuse me again. Next slide, please. Again, just a couple of brief slides following this one to summarize my engineering review and analysis. If I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. Well, very simply, I reviewed and evaluated both daily and monthly flow and diversion records for the post-judgment period, extending from April 2007 through December 2020. For the 6 forfeiture months, January and August through December. I determined and compiled releases by each of the Kern Island First, Buena Vista First, Stein, and Farmers diversion rights during their respective forfeiture months. And finally, I determined and compiled the right-by-right distribution of releases to the next most senior rights. If I could have the next slide, please. This is table 3E in my report, and it is a summary of the forfeiture releases by month for the post-judgment period, extending from 2007 through 2020. And the annual amounts have ranged from roughly 13,000 acre feet in the driest year up to about 70,000 acre feet in the wettest years. And I might note that while this is a combination of Kern Island First, Buena Vista First, Stein, and Farmers that we're looking at considering in this table, about 86% of the forfeiture releases are attributable to the Kern Island First. And the total in the very lower right corner of this table indicates for the post-judgment period, the total forfeiture releases have been on the order of 566,000 acre feet. Next slide, please. This is table 5F from my report, and it summarizes again on a monthly basis, and again for the post-judgment period, the first point group diversion and use of those forfeiture releases. And similarly, we see in the lower right-hand corner of this table, the total use also amounting to about 566,000 acre feet, i.e. all of the forfeiture releases are shown on the first point flow and diversion records, which were the basis for my analysis and review and analysis to have been attributed to and used by, as indicated by the entitlement plus or minus release columns of that sheet. And next slide, please. This is table 6 from my report, and it summarizes the annual diversion and use of forfeiture releases within the first point group for the post-judgment period. Summarizes it both in a table and then is illustrated in the bar chart, which appears immediately below the table. So this was presents the distribution of that 566,000 roughly acre feet over the post-judgment period as between the use of that water as between North Kern, Kern Delta, and the city of Bakersfield. So, for example, well, I think that probably summarizes it. If I could have the next slide, please. Now, after looking at the use by group, this provides a right-by-right distribution of those forfeiture releases. And you can see, again, for the post-judgment period, 2007 to 2020, it's infrequent that the releases are distributed to and used by the lower, lesser priority, more junior rights among the first point group, simply by the presence of all of the zeros that you see. In fact, only in 2 of these 14 years do we see a distribution and use of releases reaching to the lowest priority rights among the first point group. Those 2 years being 2010 and 2017. There are other tables in preceding tables in my report that I'm not included in this presentation, which indicate that in 2010, it was in only 1 month, that month being the month of December, that water reached the lowest priority rights. And in 1 month in 2017, that month being January. And it's perhaps worth noting that in the case of 2010, December 2010, excuse me, that was the second wettest December of the period of record. And January 2017 was the third wettest January for the period of record. Next slide, please. And if I could have you go to the next slide again. Thank you. Well, very generally, my findings include the following. 1, the Kern River first point flow and diversion records, which were the basis for my analysis, have consistently documented the administration of the law of the river for decades. 2, record of enforcement of the forfeiture, excuse me again, judgment is found in the flow and diversion records. 3rd, the forfeiture judgment has been consistently enforced since it became effective in April 2007. And finally, to the extent that the forfeiture judgment limited the exercise of Kern Delta's diversion rights, all of the resulting forfeiture releases were distributed to and used by the next most senior rights in order of right and priority within the first point group, consistent with the flow and diversion records and the law of the river. Next slide, please. And next one, please. Thank you. So with those findings, I've concluded that in answer to the question in front of this hearing, that there is no unappropriated water available from the Kern River as a result of the forfeiture judgment. Because all of the Kern River water required to be released under the judgment has been diverted and used by the next most senior rights in order of priority under their existing entitlements within the First Point group. And I believe that concludes my
Mr. Wright, I just have one question. Thank you very much for that. I appreciate it. I just have one question. Did this forfeiture judgment that extinguished Kern Delta's rights above those monthly caps that you talked about, did that create more Kern River water that had existed previously?
No, the judgment did not affect supply. The judgment affected demand, specifically the demand of 4 specific rights in selected months. The right to divert was affected, but the supply of the river, the natural flow of the river remains unchanged, obviously.
And I guess as a follow-up to that, the supply of the river, and you mentioned in the 6 months, the forfeiture months is really a low flow period. Is there enough water typically in the low flood or flow period, the 6 months, to satisfy all the rights listed in the flow and diversion record as provided in the Shaw Decree?
I'm going to object to that question. Lax Foundation calls for legal conclusion, and I think it also goes beyond his written testimony. I don't believe that was addressed in his testimony.
That's fair, Mr. Cuny. Are you able to point to a specific portion of the testimony of Mr. Ide's testimony that addresses the general low flow conditions?
Yeah, I think he's actually testified to it here, both in his report and just here this morning, that the 6 months period is the low period. He testified to the hydrology of the mean months of the 6 months. And my question is with regard to the flow and diversion record that shows a rate of 3,625.5 CFS. Is there typically enough water available in those forfeiture months to satisfy that list of rights? I think that's all within his report, within his testimony here this morning.
So I'm going to allow the question, but Mr. Pierce, of course, you'll have the opportunity to cross-examine on this issue if you'd like to. Go ahead, Mr. Ide, you may respond to the question.
Well, as indicated, I showed a bar chart showing the mean monthly flow of the river in each of the 12 months, and that the lowest flows were in the forfeiture months, with, I believe, January perhaps having a mean of on the order of 600 CFS plus or minus, and all of the remaining forfeiture months of August through December being less than that. Obviously, that's a mean, and flows are all over the map. However, during this period of time, any spikes or substantial increases in flow are the result of rain flood, not, so they're of short duration and very flashy. And the 500 or 600 CFS mean, again, admittedly a mean, is quite a bit less than the total of the rights listed for the First Point group, which is in excess of 3,000 CFS. And you see that if you look at the bottom of the river stage column on the First Point flow and diversion record. So it's very infrequent that there is flow of a magnitude to supply water to those to all of the rights.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ide. does that conclude then your direct examination? Do you have any further testimony to add with regard to your technical analysis exhibit 61 or your written testimony, North Kern 65?
I don't believe so.
Thank you, Mr. Cooney.
Do you want to proceed to another witness or do you want to break? What is your preference?
I think what we should do is, and we didn't specifically talk about panels. We are gonna go to a break, but first let's talk about where we're going next. I think what makes sense to me is to allow cross-exam of Mr. Ide immediately after the break because of the technical nature of his testimony. I think it would be helpful for me to hear cross-exam more immediately. And then what I would propose, and I'm open to other suggestions, is to hear your remaining two witnesses, Mr. Hampton and Ms. Williams, as a panel and conduct their cross-exam together. Does that make sense, or do you have another proposal, Mr. Cooney?
That's fine for us, I think, if that's your preference, if that's most facilitating to your understanding of his testimony, that's fine. I can tell you the next two witnesses are considerably shorter direct testimonies, and having them as a panel is just fine.
Okay, I'll look to
Yeah.
Mr. Pierce. Do you have a preference?
What you propose sounds perfectly acceptable to me and to the city of Bakersfield. So thank you.
Good.
Yeah, I'll be ready for a cross-examination of Mr. Ide when we return from the break.
Great. Well, then let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break. It is 10:47 now. Actually, what we'll do, we'll take a 13-minute break. Let's return at 11 a.m. and we'll pick up with Mr. Ide's cross-examination at that time. Thank you.
Reporter's back and ready when you are.
Great, thank you very much. I see we have Mr. Ide, Mr. Cooney, and Mr. Pierce. So I think we're ready to go ahead and begin. Are there any housekeeping issues or anything else we need to address before we proceed with Mr. Ide's cross-examination?
Not that I'm aware of. Hearing.
Thank you. Then I will turn to Mr. Pierce. I assume you have questions for Mr. Ide.
I do. Thank you, Ms. Kunze. And again, for the record, my name is Colin Pierce, COLIN-PEARCE. I'm the attorney of record for the city of Bakersfield in this proceeding. Mr. Ide, good morning. We've met before, although I haven't seen you in a few years. Good to see you again.
Good morning.
Your testimony is Exhibit North Kern 65, and you indicated that you relied on, I'm trying to get the right terminology, the flow and diversion records or the Kern River hydrologic record. Is that correct in the preparation of that report? Or the preparation of your testimony? I'm sorry.
Primary record being the first point flow and diversion records, yes.
And you indicated those records are prepared by the City of Bakersfield Water Resources Department?
Yes.
And have you ever had any reason to question the accuracy of those records?
No.
And would you consider those records to be the official records of the Kern River?
Yes.
And those records are accepted by all Kern River diverters as accurate and reliable?
I can't speak for other diverters.
But as far as you know, North Kern accepts those records as accurate and reliable?
Objection, he's indicated he can't speak for other parties.
Well, let me clarify. Other parties other than who? Mr. Ide, are there any parties that you can speak for?
I'm sorry.
Are there any parties you could answer that question with respect to?
I believe that my understanding is that North Kern accepts those as official records of Kern River operations.
All right.
And
thank you.
thank you. No other entity or individual prepares or maintains records of diversion and use on the Kern River? As far as you know.
As far as first point goes, I'm not aware of anyone accepting the water users, the districts themselves. North Kern keeps records. I'm sure Kern Delta keeps records as well. But the primary record is the record that is in the form of the first point flow and diversion sheets.
Have you ever actually prepared any part of the flow and diversion records that we've been discussing?
No.
And you've never worked for the city of Bakersfield?
No, I have none.
And you've never filled out a daily or monthly diversion sheet?
No.
And I take it based on your prior testimony that you did not work for Tenneco or Kern County Land Company or any of the city of Bakersfield's predecessors in interest?
That is correct.
And you indicated that you've worked for GEI, the consulting firm, for 43 years. Is that correct?
Yes, the company name has changed and my business card has changed from time to time, but I've been sitting at the same desk.
Okay. So you've never worked for a water district directly. Is that correct?
Not as a direct employee, no.
And so your current testimony, that's essentially what you would consider an assignment that you were given, that you were asked to do by the North Kern Water Storage District. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you may have said this in your testimony, so I apologize, but when were you first asked, or when did you first undertake a task or assignment from North Kern?
Objection, vague and ambiguous, or any assignment from North Kern or one relating to this subject?
Any assignment. of any kind?
1977.
Would it be fair to say you've worked continuously on behalf of North Kern since 1977?
Yes,
And have you primarily done work for North Kern since then?
no,
You've worked for other districts as well?
yes,
And I take it you're not an attorney, is that correct?
that is correct.
And you had any legal training?
No,
So you're not here today to give a legal opinion, is that correct?
that is correct.
So you're not here to give an opinion as to whether any entity actually has a right to any water, is that correct?
That's correct.
And you did testify, and your records show that you've indicated to what extent water released as a result of the forfeiture caps has been diverted. Is that correct?
Yes,
So your records show water has been diverted, but your records don't show you're not trying to indicate whether that diversion has been under a valid right or pursuant to a valid right. Is that correct?
that is correct.
And I believe in your testimony, you indicated your records, one of your summaries on your slide said that your report shows the diversion and use of water. And I know so I assume, or I take it that you know the water has been diverted because you've reviewed the flow and diversion records prepared by the city of Bakersfield, correct?
Correct.
And those reflect diversions of water through various rights, which were primarily established through the Shaw Decree. Is that correct?
That's my understanding.
How do you know that the water has been used as well as diverted? There was the water that's recorded in your charts and in your report.
The columns on the flow and diversion record under the general heading entitlement plus or minus releases has always, in my understanding and review of the records, consistently referred to the amount of water on a right-by-right basis that was diverted and used in some manner. It doesn't speak to where or place of use or purpose of use.
So the records show diversions, and you're assuming the water was reasonably and beneficially used if it was diverted. Is that correct?
Yes,
But you don't have any actual personal knowledge if the water was actually put to reasonable beneficial use, if it shows up on the diversion sheet as a diversion?
well, I guess there are records beyond the first point flow and diversion records in the form of the annual hydrographic reports, which speak to diversions and canal seepage and deliveries to spreading and deliveries to irrigation. So I don't know if that qualifies as personal knowledge, in as much as I wasn't out on the canal bank at a head gate, but those records certainly speak to the use of the water and place of use.
So that was a very broad question, which I apologize for, but in this proceeding, we're dealing with what I believe you define as forfeiture releases. Are you familiar with that term, forfeiture releases?
That was simply a term to refer to the amount of water that the Kern Island First, Buena Vista First, Stein and Farmers were precluded from diverting under the forfeiture judgment. So you could call it something else. I called it forfeiture release.
Okay. In your report, which is Exhibit North Kern 1, that report studies the diversion of forfeiture leases, correct?
It both the occurrence of forfeiture release and the distribution thereof.
And just to be more specific now, you weren't given the assignment of trying to determine whether the forfeiture releases which were diverted by North Kern were actually put to reasonable and beneficial use. Is that correct?
That is correct.
You just, again, looked at the diversions only, right?
That is correct.
Not whether they were diverted under a valid right, not whether they were put to reasonable and beneficial use, correct?
Correct.
Just the diversions. Okay, let's, Ms. Mullen, could you call up North Kern 65, which is I believe has been already identified as the written testimony of Ronald J. Ide. And actually, if you could look at, pull up page 2. And I'd like to direct your attention, Mr. Ide, to paragraph 4. If you can scroll down, Ms. Mullen. There it is. And this paragraph, it appears that this paragraph 4, I believe something similar was in the PowerPoint presentation you just gave. And there is a reference in here to use. You do say here, based on my review of the flow and diversion records for the period of April 2007 through December 2020, all Kern River water required to be released according to the forfeiture judgment has been diverted and used. And you've just indicated that, well, you've already given your testimony on the use part of that, by the next most senior rights in order of priority under their existing entitlements. What do you mean by under their existing entitlements?
Under the Shaw decree and entitlements that are listed on the flow and diversion records.
So the water has been diverted under the rights listed on the daily diversion sheet. Is that correct?
Yes.
And so if I were to ask you, what do you mean by entitlement? How do you define entitlement in the context of this paragraph 4?
Well, I would turn to my report, which is North Kern 1, and refer to Appendix A, selected terminology. Rather than paraphrase or do it from memory, I'll read entitlement of a first point group diversion right is the maximum paper entitlement of the right subject to the requirements of the law of the river. For example, in January, the James First diversion right has the right to divert 120 CFS, which is equal to a flow volume of 7,378 acre feet over 31 days, subject to the natural flow and the month's requirements under the law of the river. So if the supply was not limiting, i.e. there was enough natural flow to support it, that would be the entitlement as I understand it and have used that term.
So maybe I'll try to make this a little bit easier for everybody. Ms. Mullen, could you call up North Kern 6? And could you, yeah, please enlarge that a little bit more? Could you go a little, yes, maybe a tiny bit more if you don't mind. Perfect. That's great. So, Mr. Ride, we've now put on the screen North Kern, Exhibit North Kern 6, which is included in your report, Exhibit North Kern 1. And my understanding is this is a daily diversion sheet prepared by the City of Bakersfield for December 15, 2019. Is that correct?
Yes,
And the entitlement you were talking about, that is an amount in of flow in cubic feet per second that's listed on the left-hand column next to each designated canal right. Is that correct?
that's correct.
Okay. Now, in your the entitlement is a number, but the rights don't actually have entitlement or have water accruing to their entitlements unless there's sufficient flow in the river to reach their entitlement. Is that correct?
Objection calls for a legal conclusion, vague and ambiguous as to entitlement.
Well, he just gave his definition of entitlement. He read it, so I'm asking him more about his definition.
Right, I think it's a fair question. To the extent you understand the question and respond, Mr. Ide, please do.
Well, it'd be helpful if you could repeat it for me, please.
Well, yeah, so the entitlement is listed on the left-hand side, but these rights don't actually have entitlement or have water accruing to their entitlement unless there's sufficient flow in the river to reach the entitlement. Is that correct?
Correct. There has to be natural flow to support the diversion.
So if you look on the right-hand side on the column, there's a column for gross entitlement. Do you see that?
Yes,
Do you know what that means?
yes.
What does that mean?
Well, once again, I would refer to Appendix A of North Kern 1, which is my report, and read gross entitlement. This is the initial apportionment of the Kern River natural flow as calculated. The natural flow is calculated for a given right on a given day based on the river stage. And on the flow and diversion records, it is abbreviated as gross entitlement and is also referred to as theoretical entitlement.
And you refer to the James right, which is that a right that is utilized by North Kern as far as you know?
Yes,
Okay, and on this chart here, the James right, which is about a third of the way down, there's a number there for gross entitlement. You see that?
yes,
And that's 115 CFS. Is that correct?
yes,
So on this day, we're looking at December 15, 2019. The James right had a gross entitlement of 115 CFS, correct?
correct.
So that means that they had water, there was water available within the entitlement, which they could divert. Is that correct?
Yes,
And then just for a context here, if you look up, you see the Kern Island first right that has a gross entitlement of 300 CFS. Do you see that?
yes,
And then you see to the right of it that actually as a result of the forfeiture caps, that amount, the gross entitlement was not diverted, it was released in the full amount of 300 CFS. Is that correct?
that is correct.
Okay, let's go a little further down this list. And let's just, how about the Beardsley first? Is that a right utilized by North Kern?
Yes,
And there's nothing listed in the gross entitlement column. You see that?
well, when I say, I guess if I could clarify, North Kern is a consumer of the Beardsley right through the Kern River Canal and Irrigating Company.
Okay. Well, let's make it a little simpler then. If you could look a little further up at the Plunkett right, you see that?
Yes,
Is that one of the rights that North Kern utilizes?
that is correct.
And what is the, if you look at the left-hand side of the column, what is the entitlement on paper for the Plunkett right?
40 CFS.
And you don't see a number for the gross entitlement, do you?
No, not on this day.
That indicates there was no entitlement accruing to those rights on that day, is that correct?
Objection, vague and ambiguous. Are you talking about gross entitlement or are you talking about entitlement as defined by Mr. I? You need to be clear.
Mr. Pierce, I think that's fair. Will you clarify? Because we are talking about two different entitlements. It'd be more helpful for me if we're clear about which type we're referring to.
Sure. On that day, Mr. I, there's no gross entitlement available for the Plunkett right, correct?
That is correct.
Which means there's no water available to divert under their theoretical entitlement, correct?
Well, their theoretical entitlement, as I use the term, is synonymous with gross entitlement.
Okay. So they don't have any entitlement that day, correct?
Objection, vague,
definition.
misstates his testimony. He said there's no gross entitlement. You keep going back and forth. Be clear.
I think that's fair, Mr. Pierce. Let's be specific about the type of entitlement, please.
Sure. He indicated that they were the same thing. So let me be clear. I know these terms are not simple. So again, we do know there's no gross entitlement because there's no gross entitlement listed there, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And they still have the right, they still have an entitlement to divert water if the water was available. Is that correct?
That's my understanding.
Okay. But on this particular day, the Plunkett right had no water available, according to this chart, under the gross entitlement.
Yes.
But if you go further over to the right, you see that there were some diversions by the Plunkett right. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And how much water did the Plunkett right divert on that day?
40 CFS.
How is it that the Plunkett right diverted 40 CFS when they had no gross entitlement on that day?
They received a distribution of the water released by the Kern Island First, Buena Vista First, and Stein.
But the gross entitlement is still zero, correct?
Yes, the gross entitlement is simply a step in the process. It's the first step.
So when you say that the rights in your testimony, you said that, let me make sure I get this correct, that the water released by Kern Delta based on the forfeiture caps has been diverted by rights under their existing entitlements. You don't mean under the gross entitlement though, because there's no gross entitlement on that day, correct?
No, I defined entitlements, I think earlier, and I'm referring to the Shaw decree entitlement listed and printed on the flow and diversion record.
But it's true that there was on this day, the Plunkett right had no gross entitlement, correct?
That is correct.
They still diverted water on that day from another source, correct?
It's the same source. I mean, there's only one Kern River in this picture.
Okay. But if you go up a little further, you see the James right does have gross entitlement that day of 115 CFS, correct?
Correct.
And that right diverted water under the gross entitlement on that day, correct?
Yes.
Okay. But the Plunkett did not. The Plunkett did not divert any water under the gross entitlement that day.
That is correct.
Now, when you say that in your testimony, you said that the water released according to the forfeiture judgment has been diverted and used by the next most senior rights in order of priority under their existing entitlements. On this chart, it looks like the Anderson right diverted some water released by presumably by the Kern Delta rights. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And that was just 5 CFS in the release column. Is that correct?
No, it's not correct. It looks like it's 1.
Oh, 1. Okay, sorry, I misread that. So how do you differentiate, and for the James, can you explain why why this chart shows a diversion of, make sure these are all small numbers, why the James right shows diversion of, I'm sure, actually, let me make sure we got this right. I'm looking at the James, I see 115 and then 5. 115 diverted under the gross entitlement. Maybe I'm reading this wrong. 5 diverted under releases. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Can you explain the difference between those two numbers?
The gross entitlement number of 115 represents the initial apportionment of Kern River water based on the natural flow that day and the order of right and priority. The next step in the process is to assess use and non-use. And in this case, there was non-use, albeit attributable to the forfeiture judgment by the Kern Island First, Buena Vista First, and Stein, which gave rise to the next step, which is the distribution of that water in order of right and priority. And so under that step, 5 CFS is added to the 115 CFS to arrive at the Shaw decree right for the James of 120 CFS.
And the gross entitlement, is that just again, to clarify, the gross entitlement is established by the quantity of water flowing in the river that day. Is that correct?
Yes, and the law of the river, which is expressed in this order of right and priority on this sheet.
And if there's not sufficient flow in the river, then the more junior rights don't have any gross entitlement available that day, correct?
That is correct.
And you're familiar with the rights that North Kern utilizes under the 1952 agreement, is that correct?
Yes.
What is the minimum amount of water that needs to be flowing in the river for North Kern's right, the rights that North Kern diverts under, to have gross entitlement accruing to their rights?
Are you referring to all rights or a given right? I'm not clear.
Well, what's the first right that North Kern diverts under on this sheet?
The James First.
Okay, and what's the what stage of river flow does there need to be for that right to have the gross diversion column triggered?
Objection, vague and ambiguous. You used the term gross diversion. Did you mean gross entitlement? There is no
Okay.
gross diversion.
Gross
Right.
entitlement, sorry.
I'm just straining to read the small numbers because I certainly don't have it committed to memory. The river stage appears to be 530 CFS.
Okay. And again, just to distinguish between the two numbers now, or the two terms, the theoretical entitlement is the amount that's always there. That's just the measure of the right that could potentially be utilized to divert water. Is that a fair statement?
No,
Okay. Again, can you tell me what the theoretical entitlement is again?
it's synonymous with gross entitlement as I'm using those terms.
Okay. Okay. So it's synonymous. So it's essentially you define it the same way. Is that what you're saying?
That is correct.
Okay. So if the river is not flowing at 560, I'm sorry, what was the number again? 530?
530, it looks like.
Okay. if the river is not flowing at more than 530 CFS, there's no gross entitlement or theoretical entitlement to any of the rights that North Kern diverts under. Is that correct?
Well, at 530, the full James right would be in play. And water doesn't start accruing to the James right until you reach 410.5 CFS, which is the river stage for the immediately prior right, the Buena Vista First. So any flow over that amount, water would start to accrue to the James as indicated under the gross entitlement column.
Okay, so you said, okay, so if the river is flowing at more than, and I think just to be accurate, I think it was 530.5 CFS. If only when water is flowing above 530 CFS does the James right start to accrue water under its entitlement. Is that correct?
No, starts to accrue water when the flow is above 410.5 CFS.
Okay, and if it's below 410, then the rights that North Kern diverts under don't accrue any entitlement.
They do not accrue entitlement as we're using the term gross entitlement as a step in the process of apportioning the river water.
Okay. But then you get past, if you go past the entitlement on this chart, if you go past the gross entitlement, you still see diversions of release water. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, are you referring to a specific right or?
Well, let's go back to the Plunkett right. Yeah, the Plunkett is that this chart shows diversions by the Plunkett right of 40 CFS, correct?
Yes.
But there's no gross entitlement on that day for the Plunkett right.
That is correct.
And so they're diverting under some other column or some other right. Is that correct?
Diverting
Objection,
under
vague and
their-
ambiguous, calls for a legal conclusion.
How are they, let me rephrase that. How is the Plunkett right diverting water on that day when they have no gross entitlement?
They're diverting water under their Shaw decree entitlement as listed on the record.
And a 40 CFS is the Shaw decree, the maximum amount that right can divert, correct?
That is correct.
But there's still nothing in the gross entitlement column, correct?
Correct.
They have no gross entitlement on that day, even though they're still diverting water released by Kern Delta, correct?
Correct.
And you indicated that the forfeiture releases are diverted by the next most senior rights. But if that's the case, why isn't the James right, which has a gross entitlement of 115 CFS, why isn't the James right, which is ahead of the Plunkett right, diverting 115 CFS of the released water?
I apologize, but if you could repeat your question, I didn't follow it through.
Sure. Your testimony is that the next most senior right diverts the water released by Kern Delta based on the forfeiture caps. Is that correct?
Subject to the entitlements listed on the flow and diversion records.
Okay. So the James right on this sheet is ahead of the Plunkett right, correct?
Yes.
And the James right has a gross entitlement of 115 CFS on this day. And they diverted again only 5 CFS of released water. Correct. You see that?
Yes.
Why didn't the James right divert up to their full gross entitlement or any kind of entitlement release water?
they diverted up to their Shaw decree entitlement of 120 CFS.
The 115 gross entitlement, that's based on river flow. That's not forfeiture release water, correct?
Correct.
But the Plunkett right again has no gross entitlement. They diverted up to their full Shaw decree entitlement, 40 CFS, which consisted entirely of forfeiture release water, correct?
On this day, that is correct.
So the rights listed here, divert release water. Strike that. Your testimony then that the water released according to the forfeiture judgment is subject to diversion and used by the next most senior rights in order of priority under their existing entitlements. Don't you really mean that the water released is subject to diversion and used by the next most senior rights when they don't have entitlement?
No. Again, I mean, if I can clarify,
Sure.
subject to their entitlements. So in the case of the James right, with an initial allocation under the gross entitlement column of 115 CFS, it has a Shaw decree entitlement of 120. And so 5 CFS is distributed of the release water is distributed to the James to complete and fill out its Shaw decree right.
So the James right diverts 115 CFS of water accruing to its entitlement, its gross entitlement, and then an additional 5 CFS of release water, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And do you know why that is? Why is it that it's 115 in the gross diversion column, but only 5 in the release column?
Because the diversions are subject to the Shaw decree entitlements as listed on the record.
And then, but why didn't the Plunkett right, why isn't the 40 CFS under the Plunkett right listed under gross entitlement?
There was insufficient natural flow that day to have an initial allocation in that gross entitlement column. The flow that computed natural flow that day was 585 CFS, as indicated on the top of the sheet. And so that means that when we look down the river stage, we only get into the Stein right, and we do not get down to the Plunkett.
Now, looking at this column again, you see a long list of rights that are diverting release water. Do you see that? Starting with the, well, let me rephrase that. You see there's quite a few rights that are diverting release water without any gross entitlement, starting with the Meacham, it looks like. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And so those rights are all diverting release water only, not gross entitlement, correct?
That is correct.
But again, the James is diverting primarily 115 CFS of gross entitlement, which is based on the flow in the river, and which is water that accrues to those rights based on the flow of the river, correct?
It has gross entitlement totaling 115 CFS on that day.
Do you, if you know, are these rights assigned gross entitlement water before release water?
Yes.
And why is that?
Well, the procedure on the river in accordance with the Shaw Decree is to distribute the natural flow as measured at first point on a daily basis in accordance with this listing of rights and priorities in order of priority. And that's what's accomplished in the column labeled gross entitlement. So it's, again, a first step in a process. And that first step is simply a mechanical one to apply the Shaw Decree to the natural flow that day.
So if there is sufficient flow in the river to trigger gross entitlement, that water is diverted first, correct?
Well, the water, this is just an accounting sheet. There is no distinction, separation of types of water. It's simply what is available to divert under a given right.
Okay.
And we ultimately get to that point ultimately in the entitlement less releases or plus distributed releases is the net result of apportioning the water that day and reflecting any non-use or lack of diversion that occurred that day.
And presumably if the rights listed here, which don't have gross entitlement, if they had gross entitlement, they would have diverted gross entitlement water or water accruing to those rights based on flow before they diverted any forfeiture release water.
Well, I guess I look at it, they're diverting simply under their Shaw Decree entitlement. And gross entitlement, availability of gross entitlement, again, using the James as the example here. On this particular day, the James had 115 CFS available to it under the gross entitlement column, and therefore was short 5 CFS from its Shaw Decree right of 120, and was therefore had the capacity to take a maximum of 5 CFS, which it did, for a total diversion of 120 CFS, corresponding to its Shaw Decree entitlement.
So then in your example, the James right only took release water because it was short slightly on its entitlement. Is that correct?
The gross entitlement was less than the Shaw Decree entitlement. And to that extent, it took release water so that it filled out and its right of a Shaw Decree right of 120 CFS.
Okay. And again, so it takes the release water after it takes the gross entitlement water, correct?
Well, they just divert water. There's no first diversion and second diversion. This is simply a paper accounting on a right by right basis to implement the law of the river. Anyway.
Do you know why the James right was short that day, as you put it? Why their entitlement wasn't the full 120?
Yes, it wasn't the full 120 because there was a seepage loss that was being shared on a pro rata basis by all those rights with gross entitlement on that day.
And that's based on the percentage on the upper part of this chart it's hard to read, but it's 96.1%. Is that correct?
That's what appears to be correct. Yes.
So the entitlement is adjusted slightly downward to account for an 11 CFS seepage loss assigned to all the Kern River rights except for the Kern Island First. Is that a fair statement?
That is correct.
And Ms. Mullen, could we go back to North Kern 65? And then specifically page 2 line, and then I want to look at lines 22 through 24. I want to ask you about this term that you've referred to in your testimony. And this is the term that I'm looking at line 22, paragraph 6. You say Kern River water is apportioned daily according to the law of the river based on the natural flow at first point of measurement. What is the law of the river?
Well, once again, I would refer to Appendix A of my report, which is North Kern 1. And the law of the river is the court decisions, decrees, agreements, and practices which collectively govern the daily administration of Kern River water rights. That's how I have defined and used the term in my report.
So this is it your testimony that the law of the river is a collection of agreements and documents?
Well, I just read you my definition as the court decisions, decrees, agreements, and practices is how I'm using the term.
Okay. Is there an agreed upon list of these agreements and documents?
I don't know if there's agreed upon list or not.
If you need to figure out what the law of the river is, what do you look at?
Well, a number of those agreements were highlighted in the timeline, not necessarily all the agreements on the river by any means. Certainly the fundamental foundational documents are the Miller-Hagen Agreement and its amendments and the Shaw Decree. Again, it's not limited to those, but those are certainly the foundation.
If you could look at if you go to the next page of your testimony, page 3, lines 3 through 7. And you say, you refer here to these records reflect daily, monthly, and annual administration of the law of the river, in particular, the individual first point group appropriations. What do you mean by administration of the law of the river?
I'm referring to the apportionment of Kern River water on a daily basis among the rights.
On the daily diversion sheet?
Correct.
And that's primarily established by the Shaw Decree, is that correct?
The order of right and priority is, yes.
And again, you referred earlier, right? We've been talking about the term forfeiture releases. I believe it's, if you could go, Ms. Mullen, if you could go to page 4, line 1, I think we'll find the definition there. And here you say forfeiture releases are defined as the releases to the Kern River attributable to the 4 Kern Delta Water District diversion rights due to the enforcement of the forfeiture judgment during the 6 forfeiture months. Are forfeiture releases a separate supply of water from other water supplies on the Kern River?
No.
Why give it a separate definition then?
Well, the focus of this hearing is on the effect or impact of the forfeiture judgment on the apportionment of Kern River water. And it's necessary to define, put a name on, I guess, for lack of a better phrase, on a quantum of water for purposes of making this evaluation. So it's not again, it's an accounting term that I've used, just as I've used forfeiture cap and forfeiture month.
And there are other type of releases on the Kern River besides forfeiture releases. Is that correct?
There are other reasons that water is released.
And what are those reasons?
They can include lack of demand, lack of capacity in conveyance facilities, could be attributable to maintenance, a canal is shut down, could be a levee break, any number, could be water quality reasons, any number of operational reasons could result in non-use.
And you use this term or created this term forfeiture releases to differentiate and distinguish releases attributable to the forfeiture judgment, as you put it, from these other types of releases, correct?
Yes.
Do you know if the term forfeiture releases was used prior to 2007?
I am not aware.
Does the term forfeiture releases appear anywhere in the law of the river?
Well, the law of the river is, as I've mentioned, is a broad term. I'm not aware off the top of my head, or I don't recall that it's appears in any of the documents. As I say, it was a way to simply try to identify and analyze and discuss releases that were attributable to the judgment.
Are you familiar with what's been referred to in this proceeding as the 1952 agreement?
Yes.
And let's pull that up then. Ms. Mullen, let's use, I guess, the North Kern exhibit. Could you pull up North Kern 41, please? And this is the agreement for use of water. I'm not going to read the whole first paragraph, but this is an agreement between the North Kern Water Storage District and certain predecessors to the city of Bakersfield. Is that your understanding, Mr. Hyde?
That's my understanding.
You are familiar with this 1952 agreement, North Kern Exhibit 41?
Yes.
How is it that you're familiar with this agreement?
Well, I became familiar, well, I guess it depends how you define familiar. I was first aware of it, and first exposed to it in 1977 or in early 78, and have referred to it from time to time since, in the context of my work to study historical water supply and use in the various assignments that I've had over the years.
And you've read this agreement?
I have.
Do you know if the word forfeiture releases appears anywhere in this agreement?
It does not.
How about release water?
I don't recall. I haven't read it that recently to say one way or the other.
Does North Kern divert water based on the 1952 agreement?
That's my understanding.
Do you know if North Kern diverts water under any other agreement or right?
Objection, vague and ambiguous.
I'm going to overrule the objection. You can answer Mr. Ide with any caveats that may have.
North Kern has diverted from time to time non-Kern River water.
Do you know of any other agreements or rights under which North Kern diverts Kern River water?
Yes.
What are those rights or agreements?
Well, there is an agreement with the city of Bakersfield under which North Kern also diverts Kern River water.
Is that agreement 7689?
I don't recall the number.
Okay, it's a 1976 agreement for water, 20,000 acre feet of water.
That is correct.
Okay. That's another agreement with the city of Bakersfield. Are you aware of any other agreements or rights under which North Kern diverts Kern River water?
Not that I recall.
And I hate to jump around, Ms. Mullen, but I'd like to go back to Mr. Ide's testimony now to page, which is at North Kern 65, to page 4, lines 2 and 3. And I believe this was also in your PowerPoint or something to this effect, but you again refer to forfeiture releases at the top of this page in paragraph 11, and you say that forfeiture releases are defined as the releases to the Kern River attributable to the for Kern Delta water right, for Kern Delta Water District diversion rights due to the enforcement of the forfeiture judgment during the 6 forfeiture months. What do you mean by enforcement?
The imposing the limits on diversion and use as specified in the forfeiture judgment on the Kern Island First, Buena Vista First, Stein and Farmers diversion rights in certain months.
And who, if anyone, enforces these rights?
Well, it's been, the record is what I've relied on, and that record suggests that it's been enforced because the limits imposed under the forfeiture judgment are routinely reached and recorded on the flow and diversion records.
Are you aware that there's an individual identified as the Kern River Water Master?
Yes.
And generally, what does that individual do?
That individual is responsible for the determination of the natural flow of the river every day and maintaining the records of that flow and its distribution. And there was a number of tables that constitute the water master's report that record on a daily basis as well as monthly the flow, diversion, and distribution of Kern River water. And this includes the use of storage in Isabella Reservoir and the maintenance of records thereon, and providing a liaison with the Corps of Engineers, who is the operator of Isabella Dam Reservoir.
Does the water master enforce water rights on the Kern River?
Objection, this is beyond the scope.
I'm asking about his term enforcement. I'm trying to figure out what that means.
I think he's answered that question.
Well, you can, the cross-examination beyond the scope of the written testimony is fair. So
Okay.
you can go ahead with that question.
Please repeat it. Sorry.
Does the water master enforce rights on the Kern River?
I don't know if that, frankly, whether that's within the authorities of the water master or not. I've relied on the records and what the records show.
So when you say enforcement, you're indicating that you've seen the application of the forfeiture caps in the record, but beyond that, you don't know how they've been enforced or if they've been enforced, correct?
They've clearly been enforced, or the records wouldn't look as they do. I have no knowledge of discussions or agreements or disagreements regarding enforcement, but the records show that it has been enforced. Whether it was voluntary or involuntary, I can't tell you.
And if you could turn, Ms. Mullins, now, or if we could scroll down to page 5, paragraph 16 through 18. In this section of your testimony, you discuss prior decisions and orders of the State Water Resources Control Board. Are you familiar with Water Rights Order 2010-0010?
I'm not.
Well, I'll
Pardon?
represent to you. That's the order that's a fair. Well, let me be more specific. There was an order that came out in 2010 that removed the Kern River from the fully appropriated stream list. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And you're aware of that order?
Yes.
And that order came after the decisions and orders that you discussed in this portion of your testimony, correct?
Yes.
Why is it that you discussed these older orders, which came before the 2010 order, lifting the fully appropriated status of the Kern River?
Well, again, my understanding of the question, which is the subject of this hearing, is did the forfeiture judgment result in unappropriated water? So the forfeiture judgment seemed to provide the point in time as far as the purpose of this assignment and this hearing.
So you thought this was, well, but the 2010 order, as a result of the 2010 order, there was a finding by the state board that there was unappropriated water in the Kern River, correct?
Correct.
And the prior orders that you're referring to here found there was not any unappropriated water, correct?
Correct.
So these are the orders you refer to are no longer, they're no longer binding, correct?
Objection calls for a legal conclusion, argumentative, move to strike.
I'm going to uphold that objection. And Mr. Pierce, if you may rephrase us for a similar question, but I do think that calls for a legal conclusion that isn't appropriate here.
I'll move on, Ms. Kinsey. And that reminds me, Mr. Ride, you've referred in quite a bit in your testimony as well as in your report to a forfeiture judgment. When you say forfeiture judgment, are you referring to the 2007 Court of Appeal decision?
Yes.
Are you aware of an actual judgment of forfeiture? A document that says judgment on it?
I can't recall whether it said judgment on it or not, but I don't recall the exhibit number, but what I'm referring to as the judgment was a listed North Kern exhibit. Afraid I don't have that committed to memory, however.
Okay, but when you are, just to be clear, there's a 2007 Court of Appeal decision, and I do agree that that is an exhibit here, but when you say forfeiture judgment, you're referring to the Court of Appeal decision, is that correct?
Yes.
And again, are you aware of any judgment that followed that 2007 Court of Appeal decision?
In what context?
Well, you've used the word forfeiture judgment, which now you've said is the Court of Appeal opinion. I'm asking, is there some other, I just want to make sure there's not some other document out there that you're referring to.
I'm referring to the 2007 judgment, and unfortunately, I don't remember the exhibit number, but that document is identified as an exhibit.
And then on, we don't necessarily have to refer to this, but in your testimony, you refer to you discuss flows into the Kern River California Aqueduct into the intertie. Is that correct?
Yes.
And why is that relevant? Why did you address that issue in your testimony?
It was more for completeness and characterizing Kern River operations and what happens when. And also you made reference to the 2010 decision by the state board, which resulted in the revision of the FAS status of the Kern River. It was the evidence of flow into the intertie, as I understand it. I understand that decision that was the basis for that decision to remove the Kern River from the fully appropriated streams list.
If we could go to page 10, paragraph 44 of your testimony, Ms. Nolan, North Kern 65. Yeah, so at paragraph 44 here, and I know I've already asked you about this before, but now we see you have a list of court decisions, decrees, agreements, and practices, which together you indicate comprise the law of the river. Is that correct? Is that your testimony?
Yes.
How did you come up with this list?
Well, it represents certainly not an all-inclusive list. As I mentioned, the timeline that I showed showed selected agreements and judgments. These are probably, some of the more commonly invoked agreements when it comes to the daily apportionment of Kern River water, but not an entire universe of those documents.
Did North Kern's attorneys provide that list to you?
It was made in consultation with North Kern's attorneys, yes.
And can you identify any documents which you consider law of the river which are not listed on this in this paragraph?
Let me review the paragraph. Off the top of my head, I do not immediately recall anything that's not included. However, I expect there's a good chance that there's something I'm not recalling.
What about the, I don't believe, and let me look at the next page. Oh, there it is. So you do list the next page over, you list the 2007 Court of Appeal decision. Do you see that?
Yes.
Ms. Mullen, can we flip to page 11, please? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kunze. Mr. Wright, are you aware of any prior decisions, orders, or rulings in that preceded the 2007 Court of Appeal decision you refer to here in the same case?
If you're referring to the prior trial court proceedings and such, yes.
And you don't list those documents as as part of the law of the river?
No.
If we could go, I'm sorry, Ms. Mullins, if we could go back to the prior page, I want to ask you again, Mr. Ide, about this list here. You say, you do say that on line 16 or 17, that the documents you list here together comprise the law of the river. Now, you don't give any qualification in your testimony written down here, but it's your testimony that there are additional documents that are part of the law of the river that you don't list, correct?
If you could repeat that, I'm sorry.
Sure. Your testimony today is that there are other documents, decisions, decrees, agreements, and practices which also comprise law of the river, which you don't list here. Is that correct?
I believe I said that I don't recall any that are not listed, but there may well be some that are not, that I'm not recalling.
Are you aware of a 1964 water storage agreement between North Kern and the city of Bakersfield's predecessor that allows currently allows the city of Bakersfield to share storage space with North Kern.
Yes,
Is that document listed here?
well, there's the 1964 contract among United States and North Kern. I'm sorry, did you say with the, well, that agreement provides for the use of storage in Isabella Reservoir.
I'm sorry, you cut out. So there's an agreement that allows Bakersfield and North Kern to share storage space in Lake Isabella. You're familiar with that agreement, correct?
Yes,
And is that agreement listed on this in paragraph 44?
well, if I'm not mistaken, the reference at the bottom of page 10 to the 1964 contract among the United States of America and North Kern Water Storage District, Buena Vista Water Storage District, Tulare Lake Basin Water Storage District, and Hacienda Water District is the primary agreement addressing the use of storage space in Isabella.
And then earlier we discussed Water Rights Order 2010-10, which took the Kern River off the fully appropriated list. You're familiar with that order, correct?
Yes,
Is that order listed in paragraph 44?
I don't believe so.
Is there a reason why it's not listed there?
Well, I guess again, the focus of, I guess my reason for not including it would be only that for the purposes of this assignment, I was focused on the effect of the forfeiture judge 2007 forfeiture judgment and the 2010 decision that you refer to did not resolve that question.
So you only listed documents in paragraph 44, which you thought were relevant to your assignment. Is that correct?
I'd have to say that it's a listing of the principal documents and may not be, as I believe I indicated earlier, the entire universe of documents that it simply highlights the principal documents that seem to be relevant to this evaluation.
Could we go back, Ms. Mullins, to North Kern 41, please? Thank you. And then if you could scroll to, I believe it's going to be page 4 of this document. Perfect. Thank you. In the center of this page, under the rights of the district, there is a column showing maximum diversion. And there's some numbers underneath that. Do you have an understanding of what that represents?
Yes,
And what is that?
it's a limitation, a monthly limitation in acre feet on North Kern's use of the rights, individual rights that are the subject of this agreement. So it's the maximum use that North Kern can make under this agreement.
So it's your understanding that North Kern's ability to divert and use water under this agreement is limited each month by these maximum diversion amounts?
Yes,
Do you know how these maximum diversion amounts were arrived at or agreed upon?
I have no personal knowledge.
Do you know if North Kern has reached these maximum diversion amounts in the past?
Yes,
And what happens, or what, in your experience, what has happened once it hits these diversion amounts? What happens to the water?
the water per this agreement reverts to the city of Bakersfield as the successor to this agreement.
And that's because Bakersfield still owns and holds the rights, is that correct?
Objection calls for a legal conclusion.
Mr. Ide, you can answer based on just your understanding with the caveat that you're not an attorney.
These rights, it's my understanding that the city holds the right to use water pursuant to this agreement when North Kern can't or reaches its maximum diversion under the agreement.
So these diversion amounts act as a limit upon North Kern's use of water under this agreement. So are you aware of any other limits or restrictions on North Kern's use of water under this agreement?
No,
What about, isn't there a place of use limitation on North Kern's use of water under this agreement?
yes, there is, and I misunderstood your question and assumed wrongly, apparently, that you were referring to other limits on the diversion. But yes, there are places of use.
And under this agreement, isn't it true that North Kern can only use water they divert within the boundaries of their district?
That is correct.
And do you know if North Kern has followed that restriction and complied with that
As far
restriction?
as I know, yes.
And then I believe, there was a limitation on the type of use. Is that correct?
Yes,
And that's informally, North Kern could only divert and use water under this agreement for agricultural purposes, correct?
I believe the
Objection, the document speaks for itself as to the scope and purpose of use.
Well, let's go ahead. Mr. Pierce, if you know off the top of your head, can we look to this provision in the document?
Sure.
It can speak for itself.
Let me see, I have a copy on my computer, so I'll just take me a second to find it.
Sure, thank you. I
Oops.
realize I'm asking you something out of the blue.
Okay.
Well, you raised it, but
Yes.
you necessarily have a paragraph.
Well, I don't have it. And if you could scroll down, Ms. Mullins, I think we'll get to it. Keep going, please. A little further down. Oh, there we go. Yeah, paragraph 6 right there. Purpose of use. And that indicates that water is diverted by the district, may be used for the purpose of irrigation, stock watering, and underground water replenishment, and for no other purpose or purposes whatsoever. You see that?
yes,
And then also, actually next to that, we see place of use by district. But do you know if the purpose of use limitation has been amended at any time?
Objection. Mr. Pierce, do you want to violate your own stipulation? What do you want to do there?
I'm just asking if he knows if it's been amended.
Okay, okay. You're on your own. Okay.
I'm aware that it has been amended.
Do you know if and this is just that was just a foundational question. Do you know if are you aware of any other amendments to the 1952 agreement? Besides an amendment which may or may not have impacted the purpose of use?
Off the top of my head, I don't recall. I can't think of anything.
Do you know if the place of use limitation, which we see here on page 6, has ever been amended?
I do not recall that it's been amended.
And just for a time check, Ms. Kunze, I'm getting close to the end here. I'm just checking my notes here.
Sure, thank you.
Let's go to Exhibit North Kern 1, please, Ms. Mullen. And specifically, if you could go to page 22 of that report. Actually, I think I guess it's not page 22 and on the PDF form. Let me find it here. It's of a hard copy. I believe it's how many more? It would be page. Let's try page 25. Actually, maybe one more page after that. That's it. Mr. Ide, on this page, you talk about a calculation you did to determine the amount of forfeiture release water diverted by various rights and entities, and you used a ratio method around the middle of that paragraph. Can you describe what you did with regard to this ratio calculation?
Yes, in looking at that paragraph in my copy here, I used an example of a actual day in the daily flow and diversion record for October 2, 2017, and noted that releases from rights subject to the forfeiture cap in that month amounted to 185 CFS. However, the total of all releases on that day was 237 CFS. So I used the ratio of 185 to 237 and applied that to the amount of the release water diverted and used by each right to determine the amount attributable to releases from rights subject to a forfeiture cap. Because I was trying to, on a right by right basis, as best I could, track the disposition of forfeiture releases. And in this instance, since all of the release water was not made up of forfeiture releases, I applied this ratio to make that adjustment.
So your records, I just want to make clear that your records that which you intend to show diversion to forfeiture releases doesn't actually show necessarily the quantity of forfeiture releases diverted. You've had to represent that through a ratio. Is that correct? Through a calculation that you came up with?
Yes.
And then if we could go, I think maybe let's do it this way. If we could go to the third to last page of this same exhibit, looking for the chart where you show total annual diversion and use of forfeiture releases. Oh, shoot. Now I'm looking for the text of the, it would be page 29 in the report. I realize there's appendixes. That's why they're going to the third to the last page doesn't work. I'm sorry. If you, maybe let's go to page 34, 35 or so of the report. How about 33? I'm sorry. Now I have the right, my partner gave me the right answer. There it is. If you could blow that up a little bit more, Ms. Mullen. So again, I believe this chart was in your PowerPoint as well. This chart we're looking at annual diversion, use of forfeiture releases. Can you tell us again what this shows?
This shows on an annual basis in acre feet the disposition or distribution of forfeiture releases by group, where those groups are listed at the left-hand side of that table, including North Kern, Kern Delta, and the city of Bakersfield.
And what is a KRC and IC? What is that for?
The Kern River Canal and Irrigating Company, which is administered by the city of Bakersfield.
So the city of Bakersfield actually diverts under that category of rights, correct?
As does North Kern, yes.
Okay. And how about Old South Fork? Who, is there a separate Old South Fork entity?
Again, administered by the city of Bakersfield today. And I'm not, frankly, intimate with the disposition of Old South Fork water today.
In this chart, I think you've indicated before that the chart shows diversions, and you do say use, but you testified earlier you're not sure about the use of the water that's diverted, of the forfeiture release water that's diverted.
I don't believe I said I wasn't sure about the use, that it wasn't within the scope of my assignment to drill down to use in terms of place and purpose, but rather stopped at the point of reviewing the records through the entitlement plus or minus release columns on the flow and diversion records.
Okay. And again, I believe you said that your scope of work was not to determine or not to give an opinion on as to whether a specific entity has a right to divert forfeiture release water, correct?
Correct.
So it's not, you're not testifying and you're not going to testify as to whether the Kern Delta Water District has a right to divert forfeiture releases, correct?
Correct.
And the same would go for the city of Bakersfield, KRC and IC and Old South Fork, is that correct?
Correct.
And you're not giving an opinion as to whether North Kern has a right to divert the forfeiture releases, correct?
Correct.
You're simply showing what's reflected in the city of Bakersfield's flow and diversion records of diversions of water, which you've defined as forfeiture releases, correct?
That is correct.
That is all I have, Mr. Ide. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Pierce. I'm going to now look to the other parties and ask you as a group, I will try to pull up my gallery view, but do any of the other parties have questions for Mr. Ide today?
Yes, Hearing Officer Kinsey, this is Adam Keats on behalf of the public interest groups. I would like to ask a couple of questions.
All right, let me just wait, Mr. Keats. Thank you. And is there anyone else who would like to ask questions of Mr. Ide today? Maybe I should ask, Mr. Keats, do you have just a general estimate of how long you think your cross exam will take?
I think it'll be under 5 minutes.
Okay, great. Mr. Keats, you may please go ahead and proceed.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Ide. And just a couple of questions here, and I hope these aren't too basic. Are the diversion actions that were described that we just went through and saw in the various exhibits, are they performed by a person on a daily basis following the different priority list that you described? Or is there some sort of automatic procedure that distributes that water according to those lists? And everyone is frozen. I think it looks like it might be bad on my end.
I can see most of the parties on my end. Mr. Keats, I now no longer have your video feed, so it may be your connection. The solution may be to turn off your video feed, if that's all right, and then we can hear you and Mr. Ide can respond.
I just popped back in, so yeah, I can stop my video. I'll stop my video now.
As long as you can see, I mean, I want you to be able to see, as long as you have a connection good enough to see Mr. Ide.
I can. How much of my question made it through?
But I believe I heard all of your question. I'll try to answer. The city of Bakersfield, in their role as record keeper, as well as operator of most of the diversion facilities and structures on the river, is the clearinghouse, if you will, on a daily basis for the the apportionment of Kern River water according to the natural flow on that day, and is in communication with the Corps of Engineers as operator of the dam, as well as with the water users, namely Kern Delta, North Kern, as being the other first point entities.
Okay, thank you. And are you aware of any analysis by any of those actors that you just described? Any analysis regarding the impacts to public trust resources when those decisions and actions are taken, when those decisions are made and the actions are taken?
I'm not aware of any.
Are you aware of any analysis to impacts to public trust resources ever having been made or conducted by any rights holders that you described regarding their diversions of Kern River water?
No, I don't recall any.
Are you aware of any analysis being conducted by any agency anywhere regarding any diversion of water from the Kern River? Oh, I'm sorry, an analysis of impacts to public trust resources.
I am not.
Okay, thank you. No further questions.
Thank you, Mr. Keats. I will just give everyone another chance. Are there any other parties who have not asked questions of Mr. Ide? Do you have any questions for Mr. Ide today? and I have a few questions that focus on making sure I understand these diversion records, which I think I do, but so these are questions to double check. We earlier in Mr. Pierce's cross-examination early on, we were looking at a chart. I didn't write down the exhibit number, although I think it might be North Kern 6. Is that a diversion record? Let me look here.
Yes, Ms. Kunze, that was the December 15, 2019 daily diversion sheet that I spent quite a bit of time going over with Mr. Ide. That is North Kern 6.
Good. Okay, please, Ms. Mullen, if you would please pull up North Kern 6. I'm just going to use that as an example just to check my understanding of the diversion record chart. And if we could zoom in, that probably is enough, at least for me to read it. And if at any point, Mr. Cooney, you have, I'm going to try to avoid phrasing these like cross-examination questions because I just want to get to the understanding. But if you have any concerns about the way I'm asking these questions or that they're not sufficiently specific to get an appropriate answer, feel free to speak up. I won't be offended.
I appreciate the courtesy. That's fine. We're fine. We're fine.
So I wanted to start, I think, to make sure I understand these columns, if I were to look at the 4 columns, which are generally titled entitlement, less releases, or plus distributed releases, these 4 columns, as I understand, reflect the actual total diversions made pursuant to each of these water rights. If I were to total up the 4 of them, is that an accurate understanding, Mr. Ide?
Yes.
Okay, good. That's good. Step 1. So given that, if I were to take, so looking here on this chart, if I'm looking at the top left-hand corner, the computed natural flow at first point is 585. I assume that's CFS, is that right?
Yes.
And then we could, if I understand these records, we could hypothetically have another column here where we take, okay, there's 585 calculated flow. And we might go down this list. I realize the list of water rights are in order of priority, not order of point of diversion on the river, but so it's not upstream to downstream, but in order of priority. Go down the list and say, okay, we have 585. We first get to the Kern Island first. Looks like they didn't, I look at those 4 columns, they didn't make any diversions. So we still have 585 available for diversion by other parties. Are you following me so far?
Maybe you could repeat that last before I nod my head and say yes.
That's fair. What I'm trying to do is look at the computed natural flow and think about it, and just thinking about that flow as one. I'm thinking about the flow as one body of water. So instead of dividing it up into gross entitlement and release water, we could just think about it as available water for diversion to the parties in order of priority.
Right.
Does that make sense? Okay. So if we're looking to the first priority of right, that's the Kern Island first, as I understand it, and they would have the first priority of this 585 CFS,
yes,
up to their gross entitlement of 300 CFS. But they didn't make any diversions. There's nothing in the 4 columns that show that they made any diversions. They in fact released all of that water to the river. Is that
right?
I'm reading that correctly.
Yes.
So then we might go down and here the next point where we have, it looks like the first priority of right where we actually had diversions was, am I reading this right? I guess, is that the canal company, Kern Canal?
Yeah, the right is the Castro right.
It is the Castro. Okay, so that's
yes.
under the Castro right. So I'm reading
yes.
that correctly. And the Castro right diverted a total of 20 CFS.
Correct.
And that was pursuant to both gross entitlement of 14. Is that right?
Well, it's a little confusing.
I see, because the
inasmuch-
Castro, yes, so a gross entitlement of 19.
Yes,
Okay, thank you. Good, that
Yeah.
clarifies that. And then diversion of release of 1 CFS. And that's how we get to this 20 total diversions. Is that right?
that is correct.
And then so you might say, okay, this is just another way of doing the accounting and somehow it works
Right.
in my brain. But you might say, okay, well, we had 585 CFS and now 20 have been diverted. We have 565 left for allocation among, and you might go down the list that way. And my understanding is at the end, you get to 11, which is the amount of water that was lost through seepage. If you were to total up, let me clarify what it is I'm doing. If you were to total up all of the numbers in the entitlement less releases columns, which we could do at the bottom here, it's 474 plus 30 plus 70, which is 574. Am I doing, I'm a lawyer doing math, so
Yeah.
check me. And then you add to that the 11, which is the seepage loss, I assume it's a calculated seepage loss. That gets you to 585, which is the computed natural flow total.
That is correct.
That is correct. So that is another way, if it were helpful to you, which you, or one wanted to, one could think about all of the water as one block without distinguishing gross entitlement and releases, and conduct the calculation in the way I described. And we have, in fact, as it looks like, accounted for all of the water and shown that the water, all of the water available as natural flow was in fact diverted by one of these, pursuant to one of these rights, according to the accounting.
That is correct.
Okay. Thank you for that exercise. That helps me make sure that I'm following these numbers and I'm thinking about them in the way that they've been reflected on this sheet. So that is the extent of my questions. And thank you, Mr. Ide, for working through that with me. I will look to you, Mr. Cooney. Do you have any redirect?
No, I give you compliments for your examination and I have no redirect.
Thank you. And so I believe at this point, Mr. Ide, thank you for joining us today. I believe you are excused and I appreciate your testimony
Thank you.
provided today. I'm going to do a time check. It is, let's see, it's 12:48. So I think it would be appropriate to take a lunch break at this time. When we return, I think we would pick up with Mr. Hampton and Ms. Williams. Yes, Ms. Williams, and move through those two witnesses as a panel. After that, I think we would consider the acceptance of North Kern and City of Shafter's exhibits and work through those issues. And then I think would be an appropriate time for us to look to the AHO exhibits and then also the motion to add additional documents into the administrative record and the objection to that motion. Are there any comments on that proposed agenda for when we return? That's not the, and we have more things to do after that, but on that proposed agenda for when we return after lunch.
I think that sounds right from North Kern's vantage point.
Okay. Mr. Pierce, does that sound about right to you as well?
Yes, I think, yeah, you've covered quite a bit of what we need to do after we come back. And
Okay.
you're right, there may be some other things as well, but.
Yes, well, I think we have some rebuttal to get to.
That was one of the things I was thinking
Yes.
of. Yeah, and I don't know, to be really honest, I don't know if we can.
Right.
I'm not sure about just to give everybody a time check. My cross-examination of the other witnesses will be shorter, but we may not make it through the rest of the day. We may not get done before the end of the day.
And if we don't, then we will agree upon a day to return, reconvene, and finish what we have left. So,
Okay.
Thank you. Let's go ahead, and it is 12:49 because we do have a lot to get through. Let's plan to return at 1:45 p.m. Gives us a little less than an hour. As is true of yesterday, I would ask that everyone sign out of the Zoom conference and then sign back in after lunch. That helps us with our YouTube live stream. And I think that's all I have to cover. So I will see all of you at 1:45 p.m. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.